If you're saying a complete regime change and military defeat and overthrow of a government, that's an all-in same thing we did in Iraq or Afghanistan, where we're putting, every facet of the U.S. military, sea, air, land, covert, behind enemy lines operations, drone strikes, sad imagery, you name it.
A new sign of aggression coming from President Trump toward Venezuela.
In waging this war on narco-terrorists, we're willing to go on the offense.
Seeing a no-fly zone or talk of that, and then you start seeing airstrikes on surface-to-air sites or communications nodes and things like that, then it's probably a good indicator that there's going to be some level of troop on the ground and probably a full-scale invasion.
What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the show. Quick reminder that if you guys do enjoy this episode, be sure to hit that subscribe button and like button below. Or if you're on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, make sure to follow the show and leave us a 5-star review. Thank you.
So kind of jumping off right away, I just want to talk, because this is going all over. And I think this is kind of a good way to kick off the podcast. So just yesterday, the U.S. military obviously intercepted a Venezuela cargo vessel, Loyal. Right now the claim is that it had illegal Iranian oil. It seems like there's a lot of tensions and kind of where we're going with Venezuela. So I just was curious to gather your thoughts on that right away. I mean, that's a situation that seems like slowly we're getting to the most likely outcome is that there's going to be some type of operation, whether it's small scale, whether it's all out war. I mean, I guess just what's your initial thoughts on that?
So there's kind of two parts to it, I guess. I will say first off, I'm not a fan of big intervention type engagements in that way. However, I would say that I also understand the justification side of it from a big picture government standpoint. And there's a third, however, or a second, however, which is, for the people that are pissed about it or have heartburn, it seems to be pretty obvious that it's party line divided, number one. And number two, if you compare and contrast or even try to contrast it from anything that either of the Bushes did, Clinton did, Obama did, Biden did for that matter, it's not really any different. Especially Obama, I would say, for the 8 years that he was in office, it was the first 8 years that I was out of the military. And so I had a lot of, former teammates and guys that even went on to do other government agency work and stuff. And he was one of the most aggressive from a surgical intervention foreign policy presidents that we've had in my lifetime. He was really aggressive and it was basically not covered because most of the mainstream media were fans of his and refused to say anything critical about him, which I understand, that's just how it works. But, so for anybody that has heartburn, I would just say, where was your outrage, for the last 30 years when a lot of other presidents did things at least as questionable, if you were questioning the interventionist policy. This specifically, I'm not going to say that I don't care, because I do care what we do, overseas and what have you. I will say I don't allow it to take up a ton of my bandwidth. I don't follow it super close and, spend hours thinking about it or, digging down, going down rabbit holes to see kind of what the ins and outs are. Our government has always and probably always will do stuff like that, whether it's more overt and they're, posting or publishing videos of certain operations or strikes, or completely covert, and nobody even hears about it. That's we do that all over the world and we always have. So to me, it's really more of a broader question is, as a kind of collective foreign policy on behalf of the United States, irrespective of administration, are you okay with and willing to endorse our aggressive nature in that kind of intervention policy? If you are, then you have to be all the time. If you're not, then you should not be all the time. And my biggest kind of gripe is that most people that are either really for it or really against it it depends on who the president is in terms of how vocal they are about it. So, that's kind of my take on it.
I want to continue on this, but you brought up an interesting point that I kind of wanted to dive into. That juxtaposition when you left the military and you saw just how aggressive Obama was, I imagine it was maybe one of the first times, especially because you're going from, being overseas, just you're living day to day essentially at that point. Was it shocking to see how his policy kind of shifted from that atypical, what people want to think of like, liberal idea of not really want to get involved overseas to being, again, one of the most aggressive presidents, especially in the war on terror?
It was definitely surprising, but very quickly, I would say I just kind of appreciated the fact that in most ways, I think he went about it in a decent or did a decent job in how he went about it. To be clear, I didn't vote for him either time. I'm not generally a fan of his. However, the strategic and kind of operational savvy that I think was employed during his presidency as it relates to surgical and very specific small-scale special operations missions and airstrikes that were very targeted, very calculated, I think is a smart way to go about it. I don't like some of his intervention policies, particularly the Arab Spring with Egypt and Libya, Benghazi, that whole fiasco, because I think it half-assed it in the worst way possible in that, it's basically saying, hey, we support you guys to overthrow your government, but just enough to kind of have it completely go to shit and there be a power vacuum. It's like we only went halfway. We did the same thing in Iraq, frankly. And I think World War II is the last good example of if you're going to get involved, it's all in all the time. The entire country's behind you, and you use the entire nation's wealth and resources and military might to completely finish the job and then stay there until it's stable enough to where you don't have to be there. I think you should only do that if that region, state, country, what have you, poses a legitimate existential threat to the way of life here in the United States, which very few do. And I don't think Libya, Egypt, or frankly any country in the Middle East, even Afghanistan, really poses that threat to justify the way we went about it in most ways. But back to your question, I was surprised at first. Quickly, I just kind of appreciated the fact that he was still willing to be aggressive and go after, a lot of the people that, as a country, we had kind of declared as, being existential threats to the United States. And at the time, I think they largely were. I was not a fan of the kind of lack of support for the military in most other ways. I think funding and morale was pretty low, with the exception of, really high-end special operations units. I think the rest of the military suffered pretty significantly during those 8 years. And the morale was in the shitter, even for most special operations groups during that time. So it was nice to see, he kind of had the sack to really take it to the enemy in that way. I just think he could have done a lot better job in the grand scheme or across the board with the military.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I tend to agree with the idea that we kind of half-assed it, especially with the nation building. I guess the follow-up question on that would be, do you think, though, there was a possibility for that to be a winnable war? Do you think, because when we look at a country like Japan or Korea, where we did have successful nation building, Germany, structurally, there's just a different dynamic that I don't think we understood when entering the Middle East. It's very tribal. It's very difficult to kind of get those countries aligned. And obviously, a lot of the borders are kind of just tossed together post-World War II. So I guess in addition, do you think that war was ever winnable in a nation-building sense?
Well, I think any and every war is winnable. However, you've got to be able to define what winning is first, and we didn't do that. So the way that we went in there, I mean, to me, it's akin to saying, I want to get wealthy or I want to be in good shape. Mm-hmm. And the follow-up question is, well, what does being wealthy or being in good shape look like? Well, I don't know, just lots of money or in great shape. It's like, well, that's not a clear enough definition of what winning or accomplishing something is to actually be able to accomplish it. So that was unquestionably our biggest problem is, and I've asked almost every, if not every guest I've had on that's been in Iraq or Afghanistan or both, before you went over there, did they sit you down and say, hey, here's the 30,000 foot view? Like everybody had an idea from a tactical standpoint, what their objectives were. Hey, we're going to be in this region. We're doing kill or capture missions with high value targets for Taliban, or we're going to be in Sadr City and we're, trying to disrupt IED bomb makers. On a very low level, everybody had every idea as to what was going on, but nobody had an idea of what the big picture looks like and what are we trying to accomplish in the grand scheme of things. And no different than running a business. If your employees don't understand what point B is and you're at point A, you're never going to get to point B. Or if you do, it's going to be by a stroke of luck. And so had we had a clear definition of what winning looks like and then said, okay, we're at point A, this is what point B is, and here is our plan, and now we're going to go execute it. Yes, I think we could have won it. But without those being present, it's exactly why what happened. And so it's frustrating because, there's so many good men and women lost, over a 20-year period, not to mention the amount of debt we incurred, the hundreds of thousands or even millions of civilians that either lost their life or were displaced or maimed. And I think it's impossible at this point to argue that either part of that region is better off than before we showed up, and to me, that's the largest metric of success or failure is what is the end result, and both of them are total catastrophes. So, winnable, but not the way we went in and tried to execute a non-objective.
If you think, if we were to move on Venezuela, do you think that we would be likely to make that same mistake?
I don't know. I mean, it's for sure possible, that's always the big question is, why are we doing what we're doing, and what is the actual end goal? What is that objective? And the unfortunate part with Venezuela, again, I don't claim to be an expert on it, and I haven't done the deepest of dives into it. However, I do know that there is a lot of financial ties between our banking system and hedge fund and high-level investor core within the United States and Venezuela. There was billions of dollars spent buying, I believe it was like bonds or some sort of investment into Venezuela that, basically is being threatened by the way things are going there. And I have no doubt, even though, the administration and I don't think anybody in a position of authority would ever actually admit that, but there are a lot of interesting ties that I don't think are coincidences. And I think it would be impossible to defend that there isn't some influence financially in protecting billions or even hundreds of billions of dollars worth of high stakes investment that a lot of investors in this country have in Venezuela in a myriad of different ways. So I think that's kind of the chicken or the egg in that environment is that, what are we going in for? What's the kind of disclosed or broadcasted, that what's the presented reason why we're going in? And then what's the objective? If it's just to overthrow Maduro and set up a different regime, I'm not a fan of that because to me, that's no different than, say, China saying, hey, this whole Judeo-Christian based democracy thing isn't really working for us, so we're going to come to America and overthrow your government and put a communist dictatorship in because that suits our needs way better. Like, I'd be one of the masked men running around trying to snipe them and blow them up on the side of the road, So I think you should leave countries alone with stuff like that, and I'm just not a fan of that. So from a big picture standpoint, I don't see why we're really getting involved. The airstrikes on drug vessels, I can kind of understand. I do think it's more justified doing that than even our involvement in Israel or, Gaza specifically, or with Israel and Palestine, Gaza, that whole mess, and the Ukraine-Russia thing. enormous loads of drugs coming out of Venezuela pose a bigger risk to our country than either of those two places do. So, like, justification wise, if you're trying to kind of prioritize things, I do think that is more justifiable than anything we've done in either of those two spots.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess coming from a civilian perspective too, and this is like one of the issues of the separation that happens is, post the war on terror and everything that was involved with that, and, whether stuff you can group in just conspiracies or stuff that's just outright public knowledge at this point, it's very difficult to take what the government says at face value and say, this is what we're doing. And as you mentioned, there's just so many different factors and everything that ties in that it just feels like for the average American, it's like anytime we're going into any of these type of operations, anything that we're even considering, it's immediately met with just so much backlash because we can't look at anything from the simplistic point of view of like, there's a bad thing happening, we're going to go stop this bad thing. It's immediately what else is under the table. And a lot of times there are a lot of factors that are, hidden below.
I think in every instance there is, even something like Argentina where, there's not military operations, but there's a $20 or $40 billion bailout to help their currency from collapsing and their economy from collapsing. Similarly, and to be clear or fair, I may have that mixed up with Venezuela. I know that there are ties to Venezuela in a host of different ways, but I know a similar thing took place in Argentina where there's a bunch of hedge fund guys that dumped a ton of money of investment into their currency and bond market and economy, and so trying to keep that from collapsing is not just us helping a friend out. Like, there's way more to it, and I think it's naive to think that in any case we're just doing the right thing. There is always layers and sub-layers involved, and it's pretty much always financial, in some way. And, because the reality is there are evil dictators and horrible people all over the world that are doing god-awful things to one another. I mean, sub-Saharan Africa has been a hotbed for stuff like that for decades, and we've largely done nothing about it. We've a little bit of aid here and there, or in Ghana, we've had some military operations and, but it's very, very small in comparison to so many other things that we'll tend to stick our nose in a much more intrusive way because there is an upside for us to do so, which is frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm planning on having somebody on to talk about the genocide happening in Sudan because, I mean, the mainstream media barely touches that. There's no protest in the street. There's no real discussion at the federal level about what's actually happening over there. And I mean, I don't know if you've seen some of the photos that have come out of that, but you can legitimately see just piles of corpses from that genocide. And people don't want to talk about it. People don't really care.
Yeah, I mean, and to me, that's the consistency thing that I would prefer to see across the board. I mean, I'm a big fan of being consistent when you're taking emotional positions and doing things like protesting or military intervention. If you think about, and to be clear, the things that have taken place in Gaza are horrific, but to see the kind of outcry and backlash and heartburn and protests all over college campuses and even spilling into streets and in the Capitol and whatever over that, and to see none of that for what's going on in Sudan is pretty irritating. Again, like, if you're going to have a problem with genocide, have a problem with it every single time. If you're going to turn a blind eye to it, then turn a blind eye to it every single time. When you pick and choose, it becomes woefully obvious that there's political motivations and biases that, in my opinion, undercut credibility of the protesters significantly, and it turns it into white noise. So, if you want to have a voice for people who don't have one, then you need to have one for everyone who doesn't have one. And very, very few people do that.
What do you think the operation, if it was to go through, would actually look like against Venezuela? I mean, just from your prior experience and understanding every move.
I mean, it completely depends on, again, what the objective is. If the objective is to just disrupt and limit or completely or close to completely curtailing the drug trafficking supply coming out of there, that looks wildly different than a regime change. You know, if you're saying a complete regime change and military defeat and overthrow of a government, you know, that's an all-in same thing we did in Iraq or Afghanistan, where we're putting, you know, every facet of the U.S. military, sea, air, land, covert, behind enemy lines operations, drone strikes, SAT imagery, I mean, you name it, HUMINT, COMINT, SIGINT, the whole fucking kind of kit and caboodle that we have as a nation militarily is going to be completely focused on that to do a complete disruption and reinvention of the entire country. So I don't know if that's their goal or not. I know, you know, Trump has kind of hinted at that and saying, you know, Maduro's days are numbered, and, you know, I don't want to get into specifics, but, you know, we'd like to see some big changes there, and, you know, even calling for, you know, airspace control and no-fly zones and, you know, things like that are usually pretty indicative of something like that. It's pretty par for the course, you know, because the air campaign is, at least historically and probably for the foreseeable future, generally the first big step, and the thing that precludes or precedes that rather is no-fly zones, you know, is saying, hey, we're going to own this airspace and we're going to monitor it, and anybody who's not supposed to be in there is going to get shot out of the sky. And then you just kind of set up camp and observe and watch, and then slowly start to test the water and see what their surface to air capabilities are. And, you know, then you're jamming them and bombing them and things like that. And then it's a full blown shock and awe, and using air to just absolutely demolish an entire country and pound it over and over and over before you ever set foot in that country with a ground troop offensive, for obvious reasons, right? As you want to minimize the danger there. And so I think, you know, seeing a no-fly zone or talk of that, and then if you start seeing airstrikes on surface-to-air sites or communications nodes and things like that, supply routes, you know, power plants, things like that, then it's probably a good indicator that there's going to be some level of troop on the ground commitment at some point, and probably a full-scale invasion.
Mm-hmm. My biggest worry with this is that, and this is obviously a little bit unpopular to say, but clearly what happened in the war on terror, like, we fucked up. And as you were mentioning earlier, not only those two countries, but the region as a whole has just been unbelievably unstable, you know, Yemen, Libya, et cetera. And a lot of that stems from these different groups forming and then moving in. ISIS is a great example. My worry is that now that we're in our own backyard, if we do screw up similarly, if we start, you know, creating insurgencies in the surrounding countries like Mexico. I remember when I had Bob Porras, we talked about, because this is when Trump was mentioning hitting the cartels in Mexico. You know, the worry is they're close enough that they can easily, you know, get into the U.S. They have relatives, they have people in the U.S. I mean, with what's happening at the border, there's been millions of people coming through over the past couple of years. Like, it's just such a risky, I guess, it's a risky situation that if we do screw it up, we're putting ourselves in, you know, harm's way pretty heavily.
There's no two ways about it, you know. And again, I think you have to look at what the objective is and clearly define it. And then step two is asking yourself, is what it's going to take to achieve that worth what it's going to take to achieve that, you know? And it's, in my opinion, rare that those two things are yeses to both. You know, with Venezuela, I think, you know, there's so many other fish to fry, if you will. I mean, even just focusing here in the United States on the problems that we have, in my opinion, is a higher priority and should be focused on more than anything that's going on there. I'm also a big fan of putting pressure and using leverage against just foreign governments to police their own. You know, Mexico being an example, like, to your point, and I agree, you know, trying to go toe-to-toe with cartels, you know, I think is a short-sighted and strategic fail, frankly, because there's no reason to. You know, something as simple as calling the Mexican president and putting so much pressure and leverage from a trade standpoint, from a border standpoint, from all of the things that you could use, you know, to leverage them saying not doing anything is too, even as dangerous as trying to combat the cartels internally is, not doing it is even worse. And so you're forcing them to fix that problem. Like I'm always a fan of that. Same thing with Venezuela. Like if you want things fixed, like figure out a way to use leverage and political negotiation first, instead of going straight to, hey, let's bomb them and throw troops on the ground. And because the aftermath of that is, I think, woefully misunderstood and understated or under-realized. And I'll use Iraq even more so than Afghanistan as kind of a classic example, is that, if you look at when we first went into Iraq and you look at where the region was, and this is going all the way up into Israel and Palestine, is that, things, while I wouldn't say that they were stable across the board, they were far more stable than they've been since, and in particular, when you look at the ties and connections that Iran has with Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, those three have been the biggest thorns in everybody's side in that region for several decades now. And it's all because, in my opinion, when we went into Iraq and we, completely flipped the table upside down on Saddam, that was the biggest check that Iran had in that region for decades. The early 80s Iran-Iraq war, Iran lost those wars. They were bloody on both sides, but, my point is that it kept them busy, and it was a big enough threat for them to not really be able to have the bandwidth to worry about anything outside their own country, because they were so preoccupied with Saddam and that entire kind of fiasco. So once Saddam is gone, there's a vacuum of power. Now you see Iran is constantly fucking with us. We did nothing about that. There were countless IEDs and EFPs that murdered hundreds or thousands of American soldiers that had direct ties to Iran's funding, training, even personnel helping institute a lot of these roadside attacks on American troops. And we did nothing about that. There were no consequences for them, which to this day I still don't understand. But what it also did is it emboldened them to be able to now support Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthis way, way bigger than they ever had before. And not coincidentally, you see this enormous uptick in those three organizations' power, influence, and operational capacity within the region, and has destabilized the entire Middle East 10x from before we ever went in. So to me, Iraq isn't just about Iraq. There's these unintended consequences and blowback that has this ripple effect through the entire region that's long lasting, and I think far more destructive than most people realize.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, it's kind of that butterfly effect thing where it's, butterfly wing flaps, it can cause a tsunami in the other direction. It's these second level consequences that we don't often think about. I mean, for the cartel specific example, when we took down the Felix Gallardo, the original kind of cartel kingpin, he had everybody in line, but they were so focused on that we need to take him down. He's the king, he's the kingpin, he's the boss, that'll shut everything down. As soon as he was out of the picture, all the plazas separated, and that sparked off the war, because suddenly Tijuana is fighting with Sinaloa. Suddenly Juarez is, the big kingpin now, and he's going after everybody. Like, those unintended consequences when you take down somebody that's kind of the big bad, a lot of times there's people under the surface that want that power, and it creates such a chaotic environment that oftentimes you're looking back on the previous and you say, man, like, we didn't know how good we had it, good in quotes, but.
For sure. I've I think made this analogy on a few different shows over the years. But to me, sometimes some of the most complicated problems actually have some of the simplest solutions. And when it comes to foreign policy, I view intervention in any regard similar to a bar fight. Is that the world stage is a hopping club one night where there's, just a massive brawl going on inside, and the United States is walking by on the sidewalk. We can walk in there, and pick a side and get involved and help somebody out and fuck somebody up and what have you, or we can keep walking by. Now, just by walking in there, you've immediately created at least one enemy. And you've also, now tied yourself to another group, which, that butterfly effect can have decades long consequences. And so to me, using that analogy, you only walk in there if your life depends on it. And our lives, way more times than not, do not depend on us walking in or getting involved, and because you can't walk in there. I mean, no matter whose side you're on, you've just created an enemy with whoever they're fighting. Even if you walk in there and just stick your hands in your pockets and look around, which I would make the analogy of such an enormous naval presence and base presence that we have all over the world is kind of like that. If we're sitting right off the coast with the capability to intervene and we don't, you're essentially creating an enemy. We do intervene, and now you've just piggybacked on whoever you're helping fight against whoever they're fighting, and now they're your enemy, and they don't forget that shit, So, while it may even seem or sound like a ridiculous analogy, I mean, to me, it's pretty apt, to make it digestible and understandable to your average everyday American citizen, I think that's pretty accurate, and so I think we need to look at it more that way and saying like, hey, before we stick our toe in the water and walk into this club for a bar fight intervention, does the way of life here in the United States hinge on us getting involved? If the answer is no, you should think really long and hard about getting involved then, because world police-wise, again, Sudan and a host of other countries in that region have been experiencing genocidal like travesty for decades, and we've done nothing or almost nothing about it. So I wish people would take that stance a little more often or every time.
So you mentioned focusing on some of the domestic policy and some of the stuff that we have to clean up at home. What do you think are some of the biggest issues currently facing the United States? Yeah,
so to me, I would say look at the data, and that's, in the book that I wrote a few years ago, Unfuck America, that was kind of the backbone principle of that entire book was what most people think our nation's biggest problems are versus statistically what they are generally aren't the same things, because there's a media narrative, whether it's mainstream media, whether it's social media. We're kind of force-fed that there's these problems that are enormous problems here in the United States that statistically aren't. So it may change a little bit, but if you just, whether it's a combination in the interest of corroboration, Google, ChatGPT, Grok, whatever, get a few different independent sources and say, hey, statistically, what are the 5 most life-threatening or existential threats to the United States of America, and see what it says. What you're going to find is not generally what's on the news, opioids being one of the biggest. The Department of Education or education decay in this country, in my opinion, is tied with the biggest, which the other one is the breakdown of the nuclear family and not prioritizing, especially that first 5 or 6 years window in a child's life to make sure that kids are on the right path, so that once they go to school and now the parents or the home life is no longer the biggest influence in their life, that it's A, setting them up for success, and then B, we're handing them off to an institution that's going to continue that foundation. Neither of those exist like they used to. And so those are the 2 biggest problems, homelessness and incarceration, or over-incarceration, and a lack of really trying to rehabilitate, the incarcerated folks in this country, I think is another big problem. And I also think that, kind of tying into, public education or the education as an institution, is that you have, a society that basically isn't being set up for success in the real world after the education phase, whether it's high school or college, grad school, whatever. And I think there needs to be way more resources put into that. I would also toss in industry and manufacturing. In the early 90s, like 80% of blue-collar jobs in the United States were manufacturing jobs. 80% of the things that we consumed as a society were made here in the United States. Now it's like 9%. That's a huge fucking problem. Not just from a job, and economic standpoint, but from a national security standpoint, when we rely, particularly on China, Taiwan, India, even some of the Southeastern Asian countries that have blown up manufacturing wise, they kind of have you over a barrel when they're making things that are existential, in terms of the removal of those things, can threaten our way of life in a huge way. Now they have a way bigger bargaining chip when it comes to tariffs, trade wars, foreign policy, intervention, oil prices, all those things. And so to me, those are the main things that I think need to be focused on. But again, I would say, statistics do change. Just, trying to understand from a data standpoint what the biggest problems are is what more people should be focused on, not what their algorithm on TikTok showed them, because it's generally really skewed.
Yeah, it's funny because I'll go on Twitter sometimes and I'm like, I'll like read stuff and I know that it's purposely pissing me off but I'm like, this isn't real life. This isn't relevant. I mean, there's a lot of case studies coming out that a good portion of the actual people on Twitter, on YouTube, a good percentage are just bots.
Yeah.
So
that are, organized, designed, and influenced by foreign actors that are trying to stir the pot and do a great job at it.
Yeah, and when you start thinking like that, and it sounds like, almost schizophrenic to like look at everyone and be like, are you real profile or something? But I'll read some of the comments and I'll say, yeah, that's 100%. You could just tell like no human would reply in that type of way.
Right.
And it freaks you out because then you see a lot of the discourse that happens and then, people get drawn into it and they're spending hours a day on their phone. I mean, some people have screen time of like 12 hours.
It's crazy.
And that's all they're seeing. That's all they're digesting. That's how they see the world. And then they get caught up and, all these other issues get pushed to the wayside because they're focused on, that's not really relevant to their day to day.
For sure. And, I think the threat or the significance, sorry, I'm not knocking your studio over here trying to unfuck my back. I don't think the significance of that is understood by most people and how potentially catastrophic and devastating societally that has been and can or will continue to be if there aren't significant changes. Now, the tough part is, from a freedom of speech standpoint and, trying to maintain a First Amendment status that, falls in line with what the founders kind of intended. It's a little dicey, social media and the internet, generally speaking, is hard to navigate in that way because, number one, it's not just here in the United States. There are, whether it's using VPNs or even just overtly being from, anywhere else in the world, stirring the pot with millions of American citizens, it's the first time in our nation's history where that's been the case. If you go back 20, 25, 30 years, for anybody outside the United States to have a kind of collective influence on the thought processes that are shaping young minds as they grow up, it was incredibly difficult to have any type of foreign influence on a large scale. You either had to be on the radio, on TV, or in a publication that's, nationally syndicated. And there were always gatekeepers with editors, with whoever owned the company, and it was a slow process to get in front of most Americans' eyeballs. Now, anybody anywhere in the world within a matter of seconds, can be in front of millions of Americans' eyeballs saying whatever they want. So I don't know if it's even possible to kind of police or regulate the internet in that fashion, because again, there's always loopholes with VPNs or, servers that are here in the United States, whatever, so that is a problem. I don't know or even pretend to know what the fix is, other than that it's a problem and it needs to be addressed, and people far smarter than me within the confines of our nation's government, I hope, are working on figuring out a way to ensure, the First Amendment rights for Americans, while also not allowing, foreign adversaries to have such an enormous influence, especially on our young people.
Yeah, the closest I've seen is probably Twitter. doing that, the new update where you can see where the profile is actually based.
Yeah.
So,
but I'd be curious, how hard is it to circumvent that and make it look like it's coming out of Denver, Colorado,
So if you're using a VPN, it does indicate it.
Yeah.
But obviously, I'm sure with a lot of these bot farms and stuff, they probably have some very advanced VPNs that maybe allow them to circumvent it, as you're saying.
Yeah.
I think the best step forward on that would, in my mind, would be some type of law that if it is social media, you have to have your actual profile. It has to be verified with an ID, which again, like it's a tough thing to digest because there is that harsh conflict with the First Amendment where it's like we want people to have their freedom of speech, but there has to be this level of accountability on the internet that people have to maintain.
Yeah. To the first part, and again, I'll be the first to admit, like, I'm not all that tech savvy, but I would imagine that, you get one person in the United States that rents a warehouse somewhere and throws a bunch of servers up with some Starlink, you could probably make it look like thousands of accounts aren't using a VPN and are based here in the United States. It's something that I talked about, 5 years ago in my Unfuck America book and on a bunch of shows. I agree 100%. I look at social media accounts, because I think that you can I think you can balance freedom of speech and accountability by doing that, in that, you still have the ability to say whatever you want, but you also, have to be held accountable or have the ability to be held accountable by being able to be identified as of who is saying whatever they want. Not make it illegal, but our society will have consequences if you run your mouth, a certain way, and the overwhelming majority of the people disagree with you or, think that it's racist or sexist or, whatever. And so, yeah, I think, something as simple as, pairing it with your driver's license. When you're 16, you get your driver's license, and it could be something as simple as your driver's license number is also your social media serial number. And that same picture, basically your driver's license sans your address and, height, weight, whatever, but your picture and your full name, are attached to your driver's license, and now it's digitized. And so your Twitter profile, your Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, whatever, it's the same. It's your driver's license picture with that number on it. So now, yeah, you can still say whatever you want. But people are going to know who you are and what you're saying. I don't think that that's unreasonable, and I want to be clear, like, for anybody listening who thinks that that's tyrannical, like, I'm open to change my mind. Like, if somebody can say, no, that's a huge problem and that's a terrible idea and here's why, like, I'm happy to listen to it. I just can't think of anything as to why that would be bad. And I also think that would do leaps and bounds for the teen and preteen issues that social media causes and what they're faced with by saying, hey, you don't get to have social media profiles until you're at least 16, so now, because I ran into it, having kids, I mean, they're grown now, but, when they're in high school, if you take their phone, they'll use their friend's phone and log on to their account, or they'll use their parents' account, or like
iPad, computer.
Yeah. So now it's like it would force parents to say, no, Jimmy, you're not using my fucking Facebook account because I'm not going to have the repercussions and consequences, to me, it would be no different than giving your child alcohol. Hey, he's underage. He's not supposed to be on social media. Like, if you pair those consequences, I do think that would be a huge step in the right direction and could fix a lot of these problems.
Yeah. Well, cause you get a country like China for TikTok over there, everything shuts off, I think at 10 PM or something if you're under 18. So you can't even access the app anymore. And then after a certain time, like 5 PM or something, they're only shown like science-based, like STEM, relevant TikToks.
Yeah.
So it's sort of an education platform at that point. It's heavily regulated.
Yeah.
Versus here, you get the newest stupid meme that kids are looking at till 1 AM.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that the way China's doing it is a bit of a slippery slope that way. I would rather see social media and the internet treated, because statistically or even scientifically, physiologically, it is very similar to stimulant use. So treat it like one. If we don't let our citizens buy cigarettes or nicotine or alcohol till they're 18 or 21, or drive a vehicle until they're 16. Like 16 should be the minimum. I could even see doing something where it's like, just like with a driver's license, from 16 to 18, there are more restrictions in that window as you kind of learn to navigate social media. And then at 18, you get full access, or 21, you know, whatever it is. Like, to me, that makes more sense than kind of the brainwashing or limiting access to certain things. I'm not a fan of our government scrubbing content. I'm probably never going to be a fan of that. What I am a fan of saying is, you don't get access to any of that until you're, you know, kind of old enough to warrant being trusted with driving a vehicle that can kill people, or smoking cigarettes, dipping tobacco, vaping, drinking alcohol, et cetera. Joining the military, you know. So to me, I like that option better. I do think, you know, adding that as kind of a gateway into it is the 16 to 18. I mean, here in Texas, 16 to 18, there are very specific restrictions that only exist between 16 and 18 when you have your driver's license. Like, you can't drive past midnight, and I think you can only have one or maybe two people in the car. I think it's one that, you know, that's not a family member, or, you know, whatever. So there are some rules that way that only exist in that 2-year window. So I could see, like, from 16 to 18, the social media being, you know, organized a little different, or you only have access to certain things or whatever. But as a general rule, I don't really like, you know, shutting things off or only showing, you know, pro-nationalist content or whatever. I think that, you know, because depending on who is running the show, you know, like, you get some crazy left-wing dude in that wants, you know, all anti-American, blah, blah, blah. Then you get some, you know, super alt-right guy in that, you know, wants to do some, you know, whatever. I think there's too much room for human error there. And if you just made it kind of like what we mentioned at the start of it, I think that's a better way to go about it. Again, if somebody says, hey, that's a stupid idea and here's why, I'd love to know why, you know. But,
well, people love to say that, but then they don't provide a counter example or something else that you could do. They just say, stupid idea. It's like, well, we need a solution.
Yeah, like, so tell me what would be better than that, you know, or why that's so bad, you know, or how, even if you just say, hey, I don't have a better solution, tell me why the way it is now is better than what I'm proposing. Mm-hmm. You know, I would just ask that.
That kind of brings us to one of the other issues. You know, I think I fully agree. Like, there should be some type of regulation on it. I mean, growing up in the social media age, you know, my generation was an interesting one where, like, I can't remember before social media. Yeah. But I also saw it develop from just kind of like the fun thing that people have to just all encompassing, involved in everything. People are making a full-time livelihood using it. Like, it's a whole different dynamic. That brings, you know, along with it is that we can talk solutions all day, but I think one of the biggest issues is money in politics. You know, these companies are so unbelievably powerful. You pick Google, you pick Meta, whatever it is. I almost don't know if we can get any solution through the door because of how ingrained they are in the political system, with being donors of millions of dollars all across the board.
I agree. It's tricky and difficult to try to prevent that from happening. Again, I would say I'm generally not a fan of government intervention, really, in any way. The one, and I would say potential exception, I'm not even saying this is a full-blown exception, is if you look at it like the antitrust type of statutes that exist. I think, you know, dovetailing off of something like that. You know, I remember back in the 80s when AT&T was what Google is now for telecommunications, and that's why Verizon and Sprint and everybody else even exists now, is because the government stepped in and said, hey, you guys are becoming too big and too powerful and to where you can steamroll everybody, and this isn't going to work. And I think, you know, forcing free market, you know, open competition, capitalism style, you know, competition is great. I will say the free market in a capitalistic society, if it's as true to its original concept as possible, I think usually shakes it out. I'll even use, your example as Google right now, is that I think Google is probably not used as much as ChatGPT and OpenAI, Grok, et cetera now. I know for me personally, like I almost never use Google anymore. I'll use some sort of AI-based search platform over it every single time, and to me, if you would have said that even 2 years ago, I would not have believed you that Google could ever be knocked off the top spot. And statistically, maybe they're not. I don't know. But the amount of, kind of interest and utilization of AI-based chat style, AI platforms in just the last 18 to 24 months has been mind-boggling.
We're going to get into that too.
It's, so now, that doesn't come without its issues too, right? Is that who is programming that? Are there slants there? Do they make mistakes? Of course they do. And that's why I'm a big fan of, just like with, intel sourcing in the military, as you corroborate, you get a number of different sources that, ideally are owned and facilitated by different corporations. At the end of the day, that's always a concern. And I think at least understanding, who owns what you're using and even asking, whether it's Google or Chat or Grok or whatever, asking certain things that you can kind of tell if there's a slant, ask them kind of leading questions to see if you can get them to take a position on something. So, if a slant exists, what is that slant going to be? And then take that into account and take the response with a grain of salt, package it all together and try to find somewhere in the middle. If you ask every platform the exact same question and then compare all of those answers, you get a pretty good idea of if there's a bias or slant, which way does it lean, and then take that into account. But it's for sure a both fascinating and equally troubling time technologically, no doubt about it.
Well, that kind of brings us into one of your other issues you're mentioning, like it's currently plaguing America, is our deterioration of education. It's something that's been happening for kind of decades. It's really coming to a head now, and it carries us perfectly into the AI war. I think personally, I don't think it gets discussed enough how important the AI war, both coming and kind of what's currently undergoing with China, actually is. That's kind of, I've compared it before in previous episodes to the new nuclear weapon, but I actually think it's vastly more dangerous than a nuclear weapon could be because of all the implications that come with having the most powerful AI system. That brings with the education, though, is like right now, China is 10-1 in terms of AI engineers, in terms of their capabilities of people actually working on those projects and stuff. And, with a lowered education standard across the board, we're just not able to compete. And this is going to continue to compound over the next couple decades. So, what do you think is the most immediate fix on that? Because
to me, the simplest, fastest, and most immediate fix, I think, is disbanding the Department of Education. Not entirely, though, or I would caveat that by saying, I'm not saying take any of the funding from a federal standpoint away. I just don't believe that one small group of people in Washington, D.C. should be setting policy for all 50 states. I think, whatever the Department of Education's budget is, that gets divvied up between the 50 states appropriately, depending on population, et cetera, and just gets handed down to the states. And then the states choose each state basically has its own miniature or regional or state-run Department of Education that highlights the things that they feel are important. To me, that does two main things that I think would be immediate fixes. Number one is that it streamlines the funding process. And so, there's not red tape and hurdles and delays with getting needed funding for so many different things that schools administrations or school systems need. But number two is that it almost turns the education system, not almost, to me, it does turn it into kind of a capitalistic type of scenario where now the states are going to be far more competitive against one another in a good way. And to me, the only role that the federal government should have in that is the funding and the incentivization to do well. So it's not here's the standard testing for all 50 states. There's a myriad of metrics that you can use to see how states are doing, and then incentivize by doing. If you're in the top 5, you get this bonus. I mean, whatever. Like there's a million, I think, ingenuitive ways to incentivize in a very capitalistic way or free market type of society way, to make states want to be competitive and not just pass the STAR test and get the kid on to the next grade and get them out of my hair. I think that's the first and most immediate and frankly the most impactful way to start to unpack and unscrew the mess that is the education institution here in the United States. I would love to see it kind of come full circle or go back to a more community type schooling where, kind of like back in say the early to mid 1800s or even late 1800s, where it was much more community-based schools were. Now, the downside or obvious downside to that is that there can be a very, very wide gap from one community to the next. So I'm not naive to that, and I'm not saying, hey, we should all go back to having one room schoolhouse in everybody's neighborhood and having one teacher that teaches everything. But I just think pulling some of the positive elements from that style of education and getting the community more involved in the education of the neighborhood kids in ways, coming up with, just inventful ways to incorporate community, because to me, community is an extension of family, and when you see the breakdown of families not eating dinner, not having traditions, not having culture that they're proud of, not having communities that they're proud of being a part of, and that they're competitive with other communities, that seems to deteriorate more and more as years go by. And again, I view that as an extension of family. And when the family's strong, the community's strong. When community's strong, the state is strong. When the state's strong, the nation's strong. And it has to go all the way to that foundation, which starts with the family. But a very close bridge to that is the education institution and the immediate surrounding community that those kids live in.
Would you want to see maybe education as well that's in the sense of learning skills that could help the community too? Because a lot of stuff we teach is like,
yeah, for sure. And I think that goes back to what may seem unrelated, but I think that you could argue that this is a significant catalyst to the decline in the institution of education in America is the lack of manufacturing here. If everything went back to being made in the United States, well, now we need way more, blue collar trade focused jobs. You need engineers, you need software, programmers, coders. You need a lot of things that, we've gone so far away from making anything here that we just don't need them. Which is why we're bringing engineers and computer scientists from all over the world, and very few of them are homegrown at this point. So I think it's kind of all connected in that way, and would, if you focus on doing both of those things, I think you'd see a significant uptick in the overall collective mean quality of education here.
Mm-hmm. What about the colleges, institutions? I mean, a lot of them, I think the biggest worry is obviously there's a little bit of ideological capture that happens there, but then also they tend to get funding from a lot of our adversaries around the world. China specifically will push a lot of money into these areas. UPenn had a recent scandal on this. Harvard, a lot of the California schools, it's this consistent thing that's seen. I mean, is that something that we should consider, really kind of look at too, or do you think we got to just start kind of at the core of the younger levels first?
To me, it's not a single option fix for sure. I think that's a big part of the problem. There's two main points I would bring up. Number one is that I think if you fix the foundation, it is a supply and demand thing. That if the foundation, if the foundation is strong, how many kids that grow up right are going to want to go to some hyper institutionalized, foreign influenced university? Fucking nobody. I also think it just makes sense and is frankly a fumble on our nation's part not to make it illegal for foreign entities to donate to our public institutions, even private for that matter. I do think that's an easy line to draw, is that if you're not an American citizen, you shouldn't be able to donate to public or private, I mean, education institutions in the United States. That doesn't seem controversial or shouldn't be controversial to me. I don't see a problem with, trampling the Constitution with that, because again, they're not United States entities. So I don't know why that's even allowed, frankly. And I don't think it should be, but it may sound like or seem accurate that I'm kind of constantly harping on capitalism, but I'm a huge fan of kind of letting the market dictate who wins by how good of a job. It's the meritocracy type of philosophy towards everything, frankly, is that, if getting a 4-year degree from Harvard doesn't mean shit anymore because the product sucks and there's nothing you can do with that because there's such a good foundation in, K through 12 and trade schools that are robust, that set kids up to go into manufacturing and whatever, then the draw to even do that is going to be so minimal to where they're going to have to adapt and offer different and better things to attract students to come there, or they're just not going to come. So to me, it's kind of, almost a self-licking ice cream cone that way, or it's all connected. And I think when you look at it that way and pull those few levers that all, ultimately accomplish the same objective, then I think that's where we would be on the right track.
You indicated that breakdown in community is one of the things that's impacting the nuclear family. What do you think are some of the other issues that have kind of caused that decay over past 10, 20, 30 years?
So what has caused the breakdown in community, or what is
the nuclear family?
Oh, okay. I think it's really everything that we've already talked about. Mm-hmm. It is a combination of technology and social media, no two ways about it. And again, that furthers, I think, the justification for not allowing children to have social media until they're at least 16 is, I know when I grew up, in the 80s, if you were to drive through a neighborhood, every few houses, you'd see a pile of dirt bikes out in the front yard. You don't see that anymore, or you'd see playgrounds of kids playing sports. And I mean, you still see some of that, but, kids in high school now, if you were to see what they do on a Friday night, and it's like 6 kids sitting around a couch and they're all on their phones, not even talking to one another. Mm-hmm. Their social cues are very, very slow and ill prepare them for the real world and interacting with people face to face. So I think that's a big part of that. The other part is again, going back to kind of the manufacturing or lack of manufacturing is, a small town in most of the country. I would separate big cities, which, there's obviously a big city or several in every state, but so much of the country's population are in smaller communities scattered all over the place. So if there's a Ford plant or a John Deere factory, a IBM plant, whatever, where, most of the kids' parents work there, the community, is supported by a big industry like that by itself institutes a certain amount of pride, like take, Pennsylvania way back in the 50s and 60s, the coal miners coming from there, or the steel plants in Pittsburgh, or, beef packing plants in Chicago. When there are industry that supports families, communities, and the country that are highly concentrated in small communities, I think that's a big tie together, for those communities that just doesn't exist anymore. And lastly, I would say just the breakdown of the nuclear family, having less traditional roles inside the house, I think has been a mistake. I understand why they've gravitated that way. I'm not saying that it's not an easy process to understand kind of from, say, 1960 to present day why things have transitioned the way that they have. But I think statistically and culturally, you can look at that and say that hasn't served us well as a nation.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever seen Peter Santinello?
I haven't.
So honestly, I would recommend you should look at having him on your show. I think you guys would do a fantastic episode together. So essentially, he just travels the U.S. and just records life in these towns. And, he's been to everywhere from like New York City, and he goes and sees everything about New York. So Times Square all the way down to going where the homeless people live in some of those abandoned subway stations. But he also goes to places like middle of nowhere, New Mexico. And it's so like interesting when he goes to towns like that are very separated from, I don't want to say modern America, but like more big city life. There's still kids on bikes. The kids aren't, it has that small town feel. A lot of times they're still built around either previously that was their stuff that is still their manufacturing
industry.
Yeah. And you can see when he's interacting with these people how much of an impact that community is and how tight knit it is. And then when he goes to somewhere like New York or LA, just how separated everything is and how different it's, and how much kind of the mentality of people are in those two areas. I mean, he's writing a book right now on essentially America and his perspective on it. And I think I always recommend it. It was like, it's one of the best travel channels out there.
Yeah. I'd love to have him on. And yeah, I mean, I agree. I've seen that, I travel quite a bit and not just to big cities for work. And I think, that component is crucial, there's an interesting shift that's taken place, in that vein where, in the, I want to say early 1800s, 90% of the U.S. population were farmers. I think the biggest city in the country was Philadelphia, and it had about 40,000 people. The understanding of the overwhelming majority of the country understands where their food comes from, what a hard day's work looks like, the appreciation for having nice things, how to lay that foundation to set families up and having culture and community and everything being kind of the backbone of the country. And now it's so far from that it's not a surprise as to why things the way they are. The question is, how do you get back to that? That's tough, because technology has changed, our lifestyle to such a degree where I would argue that there's not been a time in human history where a 30-year period has changed and impacted and altered normal day-to-day human beings' lives the way technology has in the last 30 years. So I think it requires an understanding of that, and B, an intentionality in how to take advantage of that without losing all of the benefits of community-based lifestyle, has served us as a species well for millennia. Yeah.
I'm blanking on the book that I read about this, but it essentially discussed how the Industrial Revolution was a huge change for humans in general, because we weren't really biologically developed to live in big cities like this and kind of operate on that schedule. And now we're entering a whole new era of, we weren't really meant to have, this much access to information, this much processing that we have to do. We see it with attention spans, diminishing really quickly.
What were you talking about? Yeah.
It's just like the videos. I actually had somebody that, and this is kind of a mixture with COVID as well, that the age group that was in like elementary school at that time, they're having a really difficult time socializing because a lot of their social development came in that year's time of just on like TikTok and Roblox and like other stuff. They weren't in school. They weren't working with people. It's like we're continuing to go further that direction. And as people continue to get older, that kind of grew up in this, it's like it's a whole different type of society, a whole different type of mentality that if we don't stop, it's kind of a runaway effect.
I agree. It's heartbreaking to see. And I would say, really any child that was in K through 12 during the height of COVID shutdowns, I think has been greatly negatively impacted from that. My kids were in in early high school when it happened, and I saw, firsthand the negative impacts that it had. Thankfully here in Texas, the shutdown was from spring break through the end of that year. And then the following year, like you could pick, like if kids wanted to stay home and do online learning, they could, but most didn't. And whereas some other states, it was like a couple of years of staying at home and that's all encompassing, not going to restaurants, not going to parks, not doing anything. I think that was catastrophic for that generation of kids. And it's, I don't think we'll know the full level of catastrophe that had, for years. And I think we're going to see negative implications for years to come. No doubt about it.
Yeah. What worries me about COVID is I feel like we actually didn't really learn anything. Because when you look at what happened with so as you mentioned with manufacturing, so China, like we didn't realize how much we were pushing over there. And then COVID happened and whether a lot of the stuff that we needed for medical supplies, we couldn't get that rapidly, or there was just a backlog of all the delayed shipments that led to prices spiking and put the economy out of whack. And it's arguable if it's even still recovered. It feels like we're kind of just pushing, the ball down the road. But similar with that, it's like, it feels like a lot of the stuff that happened, it happened so fast that we didn't really learn. We didn't really adjust. We just kind of said that was a crazy situation. Like, hopefully, there's no negative effects.
Yeah. I mean, I do, I would say, tend to agree. One thing I will say that I am a fan of the current administration's emphasis on prioritizing and trying to bring manufacturing back. That's not easy to do. A big part of why it's not easy to do is when there are regulations that make it A, so difficult, and B, so expensive to manufacture here in the United States. Business is business. Those principles and those values are irrespective of emotion, political leanings, thought process. I mean, it's hard data, right? And you can't run a business in the red. Not for very long, and so if you just simply cannot manufacture the thing and be profitable, then you can't manufacture it here. And I don't think long-term subsidized government help is the answer. I could see like in a transition period to try to bring it back, but that's trying to pick yourself up in a bucket, standing in it, holding the handle. Like it's not going to work in the long term, and so. As we're talking about it, I mean, there's this recurring theme, right? Is like if you were to say, hey, pick one thing, you only get to pick one thing that's going to have the greatest impact on fixing our society from where it was to where it is now, I think it's manufacturing. Because if you think about everything that we've talked about, like it all leads back to that, whether it's, nuclear families, emphasis on community, national security, pride in one's country, economic stability. I mean, every single one of them, there's a huge emphasis put on manufacturing coming back to the United States and having the overwhelming majority of the working population be involved in manufacturing the things that everyday Americans need and use. Mm-hmm. To me, that's the one thing, that is the biggest thing I think that the United States needs to accomplish, because everything kind of trickles down from that.
In terms of who do you think the biggest hurdle is for that? Would you say it's Washington, or would you say it's foreign adversaries?
I mean, I don't think it's even necessarily a biggest thing. I think they're all big problems. The good news, I think, is that, and here's where I would say that the government does have A, the ability, and B, generally speaking, the authority, to really focus on accomplishing that. And I would like to see that be kind of their front sight focus. To your question earlier about Venezuela, like, why don't you forget about them right now? And why don't you get, manufacturing back in this country? I'm not an economics professor, I haven't spent years analyzing manufacturing data. There are tons of people who are very good at figuring out what the most efficient, cost-effective, streamlined, and quickest way to overhaul the entire manufacturing industries and bring them back, to the United States. And I think that should be our nation's, or one of their primary goals, at least as it relates to, everyday lives of Americans, because, that it doesn't just do the things that we're talking about from a societal positive impact, culture related or community related. If you think about national security, is that if we don't need to buy oil, medical supplies, ammunition, technology, things that we rely on every day for our standard of living, which is important, but also militarily, like we shouldn't be buying a single thing from another country that goes into our nation's Department of Defense capabilities. If we are, and we are, that's a problem and it's wrong, and that's a huge national security issue for obvious reasons. So, being able to do that and bring all that back obviously has the socio or societal implications in a positive manner, impactfulness wise. But from a cost of living standpoint, from a trucking and shipping standpoint, from a fixing things, things that when they're broken and need to be fixed, if the people who engineered the thing are here and they're at the plant down the road or in the neighboring state or whatever, the manufacturing plant that makes the spare replacement parts is, here in the United States, all of those things, it cuts down on everything, so to your question, as I'm answering it, I think the U.S. government has the biggest role to play because they have more ability to both incentivize manufacturing to be in this country, to legislate manufacturing being in this country. They have the actual authority to do it, but they also have an ability to incentivize manufacturing to come back to the United States. And I think by kind of organizing the chess pieces in a way hinging on that incentivization standpoint, is that now coming back to capitalism, is that when you open it up and now make it a competition and there's huge incentives for companies to have manufacturing here, that's when they're going to do it. Legislation is important and can be effective. We all know, anybody who's run a business knows you can't make people do things that you want. You can force their hand in a roundabout way by incentivizing. It's the classic adage, you catch more flies with honey than you do vinegar. Like trying to penalize people for not manufacturing here, they're going to find a way around it. You incentivize them to bring manufacturing here, and now it benefits them, not just because they're avoiding compulsion. It's a classic dog training technique, with that being what I do. I can tell you from decades of experience, when you train a dog to do what you want him to do because he's getting a good deal out of it, that dog is happy, he's fun to be around, he's motivated. It's a positive experience for everybody. When he's only doing what you're asking of him to avoid getting his ass kicked, that's a miserable dog. You're not enjoying life, and he's doing the absolute bare minimum to keep from having his ass kicked. Mm-hmm. And to me, that's no different. So I do think legislation and rules and penalties plays a role, but that shouldn't be the crutch or the backbone. It should be finding creative ways to incentivize manufacturing to come back to the United States.
I think you're one of the first people, too, that's actually tied it all together, too, like that I've heard that it's been a discussion since probably 2008 for bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., and it's important. But all the stuff that we've discussed, all the benefits that come from bringing it back, I don't think get discussed enough. And if we could see the second, third, fourth level benefits that come from it, like you mentioned, cost of living would drop significantly because there would be a lot more opportunity. A lot of everything being at home means that there's just reduced costs, et cetera, et cetera. That, of course, has an impact on the average American dramatically. I mean, it's one of the biggest issues people are facing right now. If that was communicated better from Washington, I think everyone would be right on board. And it's immediately like, what do we have to do to figure this out?
Yeah. I agree. And for the skeptic listeners out there, I'm not a manufacturing lobbyist in Washington, D.C., where there's some huge gain financially that I get by getting everybody to agree with what I'm saying. It wouldn't impact my life initially or specifically at all. I would get the same benefits that everybody would from all of the benefits that we're talking about. But yeah, I mean, again, and I think what I hope that it does is highlights for anybody listening, not just the manufacturing thing. It's the stop letting TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook influence what you think this country's problem is, and actually look at the data, because that's what should drive policy decisions, which is statistically what are the problems, not what pisses you off the most, not what you hear about the most often. It's look at the actual stats, because, I would say they don't lie. They can be manipulated at this day and age with AI and the ability to manufacture a story online and make it seem real is scary. But the real data is the real data, and the real problems are the real problems. And if you just stick to that, that's how you increase people's quality of life astronomically, is focus on the things that are, making the biggest dent in it.
Mm-hmm. Would you ever consider getting into politics?
Not really. I mean, I will say this. I mean, I wouldn't do it on my own. If there were, if there was a big enough movement of people that wouldn't leave me alone about it, which I can't in my wildest imagination ever conceive actually happening, but that's what it would take. I mean, it would take so many people that are very influential and already at levels where they're the type of people that have, the ability, competency, resources to actually put a campaign together to put me in a position to where I could actually do it. Then I would consider it. I wouldn't even consider it unless something like that happens. I damn sure wouldn't say, hey, I'm going to, put a committee together and see if I can get enough signatures to run. I'm not doing that, But yeah, I mean, if 30 million people listen to this episode and there were a bunch of, people that in the position to make something like that happen and they wouldn't leave me alone about it, then I would at least seriously consider it. But I don't really have much of a desire to get involved into it. I enjoy my life the way it is now. And not saying that I wouldn't, again, if I was called, both, I guess religiously as well as societally, if there was enough ask of me to do that and I felt called to do it, then I would, but that would really be the only way I would do it.
Well, I do think you'd probably be a good, perfect fit, but
I appreciate it.
But I do understand because it does come with a lot of baggage. Let's take a quick break and then we'll kind of come back, jump in China. But yeah, jumping back in, we were mentioning offline, one of the other dynamics that we should take a look at is just the power within the U.S. and kind of our vulnerable infrastructure and how that's set up. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on?
So I would say, and it not so surprisingly ties into manufacturing in a way, in that, the power grid here in the United States, I mean, we've all heard it's archaic, it's outdated, it's super vulnerable, it's fragile, et cetera. And it's not very robust from an output standpoint. Here in Texas, as an example, even as good of a state as Texas is, generally speaking, the power network is not great here. And it's that way, really across the country. And so when you look at that, both as a national security standpoint, where it'd be very easy to attack because of its vulnerabilities physically and software-wise, coupled with the fact that, population isn't decreasing, the need for energy is absolutely and exponentially increasing, especially with the importance of AI, data centers, the AI race, the technology suck that is as it relates to electric power. There needs to be a very robust and significant complete overhaul of that system. Now, most people hear that and they think, underground cables and, more robust security around transformers, et cetera. But the reality is how it's being generated. Solar and wind have their applications, but I think they're augments, they're supplements. They're not primary drivers, at least the way technology is now. They're also huge eyesores. Some people, maybe they don't give a shit. Drives me nuts, the windmills that are out in the water that are killing, droves of enormous mammals that, and I'm sure has a lot of other impacts, not to mention the, bird wildlife that gets slaughtered every year from windmills all over the place, and they look terrible, but
not even that efficient.
Yeah, more importantly, they're not that efficient. The amount of oil that one, wind turbine takes is laughable in terms of kind of the contradiction that it's supposed to be, bringing to the table. So to me, the very simple, smartest, safest, and most economical and kind of wrapping all of those concerns into one solution is nuke power. Now,
I was curious where you're going there.
Yeah, now that most people, they hear nuke power and they think Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, that, they think of the worst case scenario and admitted like that is a concern. Technology from when that took place to what we have now is not comparable, just like automobiles, electronics, everything else, like nuclear technology has similarly exploded the same way that every other level of technology in the world has. And so I also think a lot of people assume that that's like, a couple of massive nuke plants that are the size of a town, and one or two of them. I think every state, just like with the Department of Education, instead of a national Department of Energy, not that I would get rid of the Department of Energy, but each state has its own state-run Department of Energy, that's their thing. Piggybacks off of the nationally run Department of Energy that does, nuke missile transfers and nuclear technology across all spectrums. So you can piggyback on their lessons learned, their technology, their protocols, their understanding of the nuke space. But each state has its own department that is in charge of having regional, small, safe, secure nuke sites that each state is responsible for constructing, maintaining, their own nuke sites to power their own states. Now, if there's surpluses, you could have a national surplus bank the same way they do with, say, strategic oil reserves, is that any state that's producing more than they need, like incentivize that so that states do. And if there's a state that can't quite keep up, well, then you got them covered. But what that does is that, the long-term goal of not just being able to meet the need now, which I would argue is not even being met with rolling blackouts here in Texas in the heat of the summer or the cold of winter. Same with California. There are other states that experience that. Like we're already not keeping up with what the demand is now. And especially with the really crucial AI race with China and just where things are going AI-wise and robotics-wise, et cetera, the data center explosion that's already taking place and going to continue to escalate over the next decade or two or foreseeable future is going to expound on that draw and that need for power, and that fixes it. It's crazy clean. At this point with technology, it's super safe. Going back to manufacturing, it's also an entire industry.
I was just about to say
that there's an enormous amount of engineering, manufacturing, security, upkeep and maintenance. There's an entire industry of jobs that would be created out of nothing essentially. And you get all those benefits of cheaper, cleaner energy, national security wise, way harder to mess with and attack from kind of a cybersecurity standpoint. So to me, there's really all upside. I don't really see any downside for the naysayer or the skeptic that would say, well, it has potential to go bad. It does. To me, I would rather have that as the risk that I'm dealing with all of the upside than having none of that upside and having just as big a risk from a security standpoint and not meeting the energy need from a national security standpoint that exists currently.
Can you highlight what that vulnerability is? Because I feel like there is a small population that actually knows how vulnerable our systems currently are, but
it's twofold. So the biggest one, in my opinion, is the cyber aspect, is the weakness but it's connected in the physical security of big transformer and substations being, have a 6-foot chain link fence around it out in the middle of nowhere with not even a camera on it, blowing something like that up. Now, granted, that's not a long-term shut down the system, but when you combine that with very weak cybersecurity protocols for the grid, because it's so patchworked in nationally that like that vulnerability between physical and cyber makes it frankly ripe for the picking. And the cyber side is what worries me far more than the physical side, because that's the long-term impacts, is that That's where, you know, in Iran, China, Russia has the ability to shut massive grids down for long periods of time. And that's a huge problem, you know. So, by switching everything over to small regional nuke sites that are state run, I just think, man, there's so much upside, so little downside. And when you're really thinking long term, both from a national security standpoint and from a standard of living standpoint, like I don't see an alternative, you know. So
yeah, I mean, I tend to agree. And the thing is too, I mean, we were talking about from national security standpoint, I almost feel like we've gotten complacent with the way that we handle kind of our current infrastructure versus the public, quote unquote, outcry of us having to be a little bit more conscientious about what could happen means that we would structure that better. Because as the AI war kind of continues to get, quote unquote, hot, it's gonna, you know, there's gonna be attacks, whether it be cyber, even physical attacks. Like one of the ones I point to is, I believe it was in 2018. Did you hear about that 12-man group that attacked stuff like that's probably going to become more commonplace because if you're a China, if you're a Russia, whether it's using a proxy to do it or whether it's just a direct cyber attack, being able to cripple us for a couple weeks, even a couple days, can have a massive impact on you know, the differences in the war there.
Yeah, and there's two things. I mean, one, I want to reiterate my point, and this is with everything that I've said, is that, you know, that's what I think, right? I'm not saying I'm the world's subject matter expert on fixing the electricity crisis, you know, within the human species. If what I'm saying you think is ridiculous, tell me why it's ridiculous. Tell me what the better solution is, and I'm happy to change my mind and adopt your position if it makes sense. Back to your point that you just made, again, goes back to manufacturing, and that, you know, the vulnerabilities that exist, a big part of why they exist is because so many of the things, even transformers, aren't made here in the United States. You know, obviously, if software and hardware and infrastructure that we're relying on for these electric networks and grid systems within the United States aren't even made in the United States, it's obviously way easier for wherever they were made for that country's hacking department to fuck with our stuff, you know, or even from a physical security standpoint, they're going to understand the weak points of substations and transformers, et cetera. So again, in the industry, energy as a broad spectrum industry, should all be done right here in the United States to have a much more robust capability, both from a supply standpoint as well as a security standpoint.
Transferring to some actual manufacturing that is happening in the United States, at least to the level that I know, some of these new modern military contractors. So we look at like a Palantir, we look at Anduril, we look at Shield AI. How do you see kind of these new industries that are developing in tandem with kind of these almost sci-fi technologies, and then also introducing AI for field use and everything like that?
To me, it's a huge relief, and it gives me both hope and optimism that everything that we're talking about is possible. You know, to me, like proof of concept wise, it tells me that when there's, you know, the kind of almost radical lack of legislation and what's the word I'm looking for? You know, guidelines, rules. I'm having a brain fart with the like the EPA is a classic example of the rules that are put in place that trip up everybody.
Policy hurdles.
There's a word I'm looking for that I can't figure it out, but the reality is that, you know, the limitations that generally prohibit free markets from developing stuff like that, you know, to me, that's a very good proof of concept that it does work, because they're smaller, more niche, kind of coming out of inception type of industries that, when they're unbridled and incentivized through big government contracts, because the military needs to adopt cutting edge technology rapidly, and implement it into the battle space, is that tells me that that would apply with everything else. Regulations. I don't know why I was brain farting on regulations, but it's the regulations that typically stifle all of that growth and the quickness with which that growth can take place. So I love to see it, because it's important. I mean, again, if our military is relying on Chinese drones to fight a war in Iraq, that's a big problem, and so again, I'll reiterate, it should start with the military. Everything our military uses should be manufactured, made, engineered, and kept up or taken care of, should be made here in the United States. And if we can do it with that, that's a good test case to say, well, we can and should do it with everything else.
Mm-hmm. What about these technologies on the way that war is fought?
Can you be more specific with the question?
I'm not even quite sure if I can, because it is such a dramatic shift. But what about how these technologies are shifting the way the war is fought, in the sense of, even 20 years ago, I would say World War I was probably the first time or the best comparison of new technologies really shifting the dynamic of war. Now we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, Israel, Gaza, just around the globe, the impact of drone warfare, the impact of these AI technologies. And I'd even argue that we're just seeing the beginning of it, because the U.S. hasn't even rolled out some of the technologies like Eagle Eye from Anduril. How do you see that impacting how war is actually fought?
I mean, it will continue to revolutionize both strategy, doctrine, standard operating procedure, tactics, all of it. I will say, it's really nothing new, though. I think it's maybe more dramatic in terms of the leap of technology that's taking place. But you could go back to the Gatling gun, as a good example of, that technology, which turned into machine guns, wildly changed the way combat is approached. Mm-hmm. You could take it even further back to, say, the bow and arrow, or the longbow, particularly in the first millennia, is that, that, or the catapult, going back even further, so there's always been gunpowder, another example. I mean, there's routinely and consistently been technology advances that have drastically altered the way men combat one another. And I think this is no different. I do think that it's accelerated both in scale and in scope. But, it's one of those, and I've heard this talked about as it relates to the AI race in terms of combat with China, which is where, one of the biggest kind of discussion points that I've had with other military leaders and minds is the AI targeting, or the use of AI for targeting individuals with no human interaction, from start to finish. So in other words, AI is deciding to engage human beings and taking their life. And are we okay with that? The unfortunate reality is that while no, I'm not, I don't know that we're going to have a choice, and I hate to even use that answer, because it does feel a little chicken shit. I hope that we do, but the reality is, just like fighting terrorists, there were elements of the war on terror and Iraqi freedom, that were essentially forced to do and conduct operations, in ways that maybe we weren't comfortable doing, because our adversary honestly didn't give us a choice. And you can only kind of tie your own hands behind your back for so long before now you're essentially going on a suicide mission, because you're not willing to do what the other side will do. Now, I want to caveat that with that A is a slippery slope, and B doesn't mean that you just get to abandon your principles. But I do think that it does require an initial hard look at how we utilize it, how we don't utilize it, but also, being at least open-minded enough to explore the possibilities of how we utilize it to the best of our advantage without abandoning our core principles as Americans in terms of how we conduct ourselves in wartime environments. And that's a difficult thing to do, because if China decides, hey, we don't give a shit about, human rights, we're going to let AI just slaughter whoever they want, and it goes into a full-blown Terminator 2 type of scenario, and you're saying, well, we're always going to have that one guy in between, and those seconds or even milliseconds of hesitation can be the difference between winning and losing on the battlefield. And so like you're essentially forced to at least take that into account. Again, I'm not saying that means that you just go full blown wide open willy-nilly with it. But you do have to kind of come to the realization and be honest with yourself that, the adversary is going to push the envelope, and they're not going to adhere to the same, levels of standard or principle that we do. And, that is a factor.
Mm-hmm. With that too, would it worry you that it would make, and this is a weird way to ask this question, but would it worry you that it would make war less personal? We were kind of talking offline where, historically in antiquity or whatever, obviously they're fighting, swords, one-on-one, face-to-face, right? And then modern wars adjusted a little bit, but there's still that level of personal fighting. Now it shifts to, as you're saying, a drone operator in Vegas could be the one taking the shot, which we have been doing for a little bit, to the point now where essentially it's an algorithm that decides to take this person down or not. Does it worry you that may make war decisions easier? Like we were talking with Venezuela, just to say, hey, we're just going to have the robots go do it type of deal.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of a yes and no. I mean, to me, there is no decision in combat that's easy or not personal, to some degree. There's a weird kind of double-edged sword to that, in that, if the playing field is leveled to a degree with where now it's overwhelmingly just machines taking out other machines, which it could get to that point, right? Then what are you even talking about? Now it's chess.
Yeah.
Really expensive chess, So, I could see it kind of going in waves where, whoever has the first jump, it's kind of like when night vision came out, I mean, even today still, Iraq and Afghanistan, like having night vision versus an opponent that doesn't have it is, I mean, it's laughable, the advantage you have by being able to have high quality Gen 4 night vision when your opponent has zero is absurd. Couple that with close air support and drones and FLIR and ISR and all the different technological capabilities that we possess that most of our enemies over the last 20 years have not. It's already kind of made it very impersonal in so many ways. To your point, I guess. So I wouldn't say that I necessarily worry about it. It is an interesting perspective, but like I said, it's kind of already been that way. I mean, fighter jets have been doing that for decades, drones for decades, cyber attacks, same thing. I mean, so we've kind of already not even just dipped our toe in it, but we've been standing waist high in that water for a while now already. So I don't see it being this huge shift of like, wow, this seems like we're now just playing video games more so than we already have, because we really already have for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess it's just, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I guess the question just stems from that idea. It's like, if you have to make the decision yourself, right? Like you're contemplating, you're looking at it. It's like, if there was a button here that said, you hit this button, random person dies, right?
Yeah.
You hit that button, you have to think about that. Versus if the machine completely on its own goes and hits that button itself, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, it's so largely already that way, though. I mean, take even ground fighting as an example. Unless you're entering a room this size where my barrel is 3 feet from your face and I'm seeing your head explode from pulling the trigger, sniper shots. I mean, yes, there's an absolute intimacy with having a scoped rifle, but, rockets, mortars, artillery, airstrikes. To me, it's really the same premise and principle as food. That may seem like a ridiculous comparison, but, how many people in the United States right now actually kill and eat their own food? Yeah. Almost nobody, percentage-wise. Most people go to a restaurant or a grocery store and they never saw the animal that they're eating. They have no idea what, from the time it was born or even before it was born and until it was processed, slaughtered, packaged, shipped, like they go buy a pack of steaks from Costco or whatever and don't even think twice about it, So yeah, that is a component. But again, I would argue that we've already been on that path to a significant degree already. But yes, I can see it getting even worse that way.
In terms of our military structure and how we operate too, do you think there's going to have to be a pretty dramatic shift? Because I don't know if we're learning lessons from Ukraine directly, but I would imagine, again, with drones just being such a dangerous threat, you see it all. Like that's essentially the footage that's coming out of Ukraine just as consistently.
Yeah.
Drone operators, this and that. Does it shift tactically how we operate, how many soldiers maybe want on the ground? Like what does that war look like?
Yeah, it absolutely does. But like I said, it has been. I would say, even though we don't have American boots on the ground officially, in Ukraine, the amount of kind of liaison and interaction and cooperative sharing technology-wise of getting real world feedback on both ends on our assistance to Ukraine and a lot of the drone strikes and anti-drone technology that they're employing, like we're pretty in the weeds on that. So yes, but we already are doing that. And in terms, to your question of how does that shift it, the reality of combat is that you're always adapting to the environment and to the enemy's tactics. And that's been the same since, the Persians and Spartans were fighting. And from then all the way up until as we're sitting here, that's always been the case, always going to be the case. The technology, I'm not going to say is irrelevant, because I do think in the last 20 or 30 years, the span and the scope of technology has been elevated significantly. So, it's changing bigger and faster, but the principles of how you're adapting to it are really the same as they've always been.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the AI cyber race between China and the U.S., what do you think in terms of military development or weapons development, do you think is the most critical thing to have the upper hand on?
Drones.
Mm-hmm.
To me, whether you're talking fighter jet size drones or DJI from Best Buy size drones and everything in between, to me, that is the biggest both threat and capability that we need to have and to be able to defeat or at least deal with. For a number of years, 10 plus years ago, there was a lot of talk about space lasers, and the ability to send a satellite into outer space and have it hover over country X and shoot this Star Trek beam down and wipe out, like a nuclear attack, but a laser beam. And, the reality of it is that warfare, just like every other aspect of human society, boils down to finances. That is the reality is supply routes or the ability to resupply and how much money you have to fight a war is going to dictate your ability to actually win it, and something as simple as that, the amount of money that it takes to accomplish that, and the fact that it's essentially a one-use thing because of the amount of energy that's coming from it makes it impossible to hide, which means it's very easy to target and destroy after it's used one time, makes those almost obsolete, and that was like, this is going to be our biggest problem until all of a sudden it wasn't, because there's an easy defeat mechanism for that in what I just explained. And so the problem with drones is twofold. Number one is that they're extremely cheap, And you think about a small quadcopter that can carry, let's say, a 5-pound payload, right? Which is nothing. What it costs to make one of those, manufacture one of those, and attach 5 pounds of high explosive to it. China is so far ahead of us in their ability to mass produce and kind of own, from a chain of custody standpoint, the entire manufacturing process for those drones, to where even if we have the technology to defeat them, the sheer volume in that, one of those drones costs them $9 to make, maybe. I don't know what it is. But it's not a lot, right?
Literally that. Yeah.
So instead of having F-22 drones that cost $30 million, they have 9,000 $10 quadcopter drones with 5 pounds of explosives that, when sent in a swarm, you can't defeat that, And if you shoot 9,900 of them down out of the 10,000 that they launched, well, there's still 100 of them. So there's 500 pounds of explosives scattered over, however far apart they want, or can get through whatever type of web network of anti-drone technology and surface to air type of defense capability you have, that it's going to get through. And so let's say they launch 10,000, at the White House, and 10,000 at the Pentagon, and 10,000 at every U.S. military base, in the country. Like, some of them are going to get through, and I think that's the biggest thing, that it's not that sexy, because, it's kind of low technology wise. It isn't the thing that you're like, I can't even imagine what they're coming up with. And yes, there are those things, but that's really where the name of the game is, because it's volume, and it's cheap, and it's disposable, and it's impossible to defeat. And so, and that's just one single application, right? It's an air assault using drones. I mean, now you go into subsurface, right? Submarine drones. Russia currently has a bunch of them. The Poseidon nuke drones that can travel crazy speeds, have a payload that will wipe out enormous swaths of seaboard in the United States, cause tsunamis, fallout, be catastrophic. And they're unmanned, and
those are unmanned.
Yeah. And they're currently circling the globe as we speak, and so, like, that capability is already there,
How do those operate? Because I've heard very little on that.
Yeah. I mean, there's not a ton of information, as you can imagine, other than that they exist. They should scare the shit out of you. And I hope that we have teams of people that are 24/7 working on countermeasures to try to defeat them or mitigate, the threat that they pose. My understanding is that they're unmanned. They have a significant nuclear capable payload, and they're already, kind of circumventing the globe as we speak. In I don't know how many there are, but I would suspect probably dozens of them. They're a threat for sure. So something as simple as, launching one of those into shoreline, up and down the east and west coast. Let's say there's half a dozen on each coast. Imagine the fallout and the problems that would cause. It would be catastrophic,
Is the idea that their payload would cause a tsunami type of event? Or
yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know for sure. Again,
the concept.
Yeah, I mean, at least I'm not going to say we as a military or as a Department of Defense has a very limited knowledge base on what their capability is. Private sector, does. I know they exist. I know it's significant. I have, what I've already mentioned is about my understanding of them. I'm sure that I hope that there are people within our government confines that have a much greater understanding of their capacity and capability. But, again, that's one example. I mean, and there are dozens of examples of applications utilizing unmanned drone technology, whether it's in the air, whether it's on land, whether it's subsurface, there's a lot of different potential there. And the human imagination, which can be a real motherfucker sometimes, is the limit, which is almost limitless. So especially when you start integrating AI, ask AI, how would you defeat the U.S. military? I mean, there's, it's kind of a scary prospect to think as, not just the United States, but China, Russia, Iran, whatever, are developing these incredibly complex AI systems to come up with mechanisms to destroy societies and wreck mankind. It just kind of avalanches into a nightmare apocalypse scenario. But back to your question, I think, to me, that's the biggest worry is that unmanned, lower technology, lower cost, but in crazy volume drone technology in sea, air, and land that, you can only defeat to a certain point. The biggest kind of card up our sleeve is our own nuclear capability, which, again, I would say props to Trump for reinvigorating our nuclear program. Wish that we didn't have to, but we need to, and it needs to be a significant enough threat that we have the capability to remove a country from the planet should they employ some tactic like that on us, that we have an ability to still respond like that. Because I think that's our biggest ace in the hole, to be able to prevent or at least discourage something like that from happening.
Yeah, I mean, I just had Kyle Hanselman on a couple weeks ago, and former NSA hacker and everything, and he was talking about drones, and he was saying he's genuinely surprised that we haven't seen an assassination attempt, a terrorist attack by one of these drone systems yet. Because as you highlighted, I mean, you can go to Costco and buy one for $20 that can run autonomously or very easily be converted to one. And he's like, in terms of intelligence gathering, in terms of the way we operate, like, that's so easy to get right under the noses of authority, bring it somewhere like DC and, use it for an attack or target a military base with it. Like, whatever you're trying to do, these operate at such a low level and are so simplistic that, it opens the doors for a lot of those type of things.
Agreed. And even something like, because it's been, fairly front of mind here recently, the Charlie Kirk scenario, the prospect and the ease of use that I think in that similar capacity that you could use a drone to accomplish that same thing is very real. I share that same surprise that you do, that you haven't seen more of that. Now, on a lower level, I'm not surprised that you haven't seen state-sponsored stuff like attacking the White House or the Pentagon or things like that, because of the ramifications and the consequences that our government would enact on a foreign state for trying something like that. But for the one-off lone wolf stuff, I'm glad that we haven't seen that. I hope we continue to not see it, but I am equally surprised that we haven't.
Yeah, well, even, for attacking at a state level or something, you pick a terrorist group now, again, like their Iranian proxy, whatever it might be, they're getting fed these systems, Again, we've had an open border for a couple of years now that have led in. This kind of stems to the China issue too, and I want to touch that in a sec, but, that technology is so easy to get over it if you just get some terrorist group with an incentive to try to go for it. They may not be able to target Trump or somebody, but they can even attack a school, attack a local politician, whatever it may be, just to kind of send a message. It's just a scary prospect. And, as you highlighted, like, I don't really think people grasp how simple and yet significant it can be.
For sure. And like I said, I'm glad that we haven't seen that. I hope we continue to not see it. And I don't want to fearmonger or live in a society where all we do is focus on the what if doom and gloom scenario. I think it's equally important not to bury your head in the sand and assume that nothing bad's going to happen. The way we all kind of were on September 10th of 2001. I hope that it doesn't come to that, but it is a very real threat and possibility. I think, the reality is you can only live your life so precautiously. Is that a word, precautiously?
I'd say so.
It should be if it's not cautiously. Preemptive in terms of your security protocols. Like, I think, do what makes sense and what's realistic and what's not overbearingly obnoxious. Situational awareness, having some sort of family E&E plan, things that are simple and basic and cover most bases. At the end of the day, you can only do so much, and we can all only do as much as you're capable of. But it should be something that you at least consider, think about, and have some sort of plan for.
Yeah, and I think it's just really important for people to, again, not necessarily look at everything and be afraid. Again, actually, we had this conversation with Kyle when we were talking about, Palantir, and like we're giving, a private company a lot of power, a lot of insight into U.S. operations, et cetera. And, with the way technology is now and how advanced they're quickly getting, there's just a lot of potential issues there. But he brought up a really good point of looking at it. He's like, you got to be cautious about everything, but you should also be optimistic. But if you at least look at what the risks are and they're in your head and you can actually think about it, not looking at it doom and gloom and saying, the world's over, but at least looking at it and saying, I understand what the risks are here. So if it starts going that direction, you can quickly adjust. But then you also have to look at what the opportunities are. And, again, like war could totally shift with all these evolving technologies that there's no longer actual combat. It's just cyber hacking. It's just chess like type of deal. Like there always is net positives. It's just we have to be conscious of what the potential net negatives are too.
Yeah, and to me, it's really no different than, I'd say the last probably 70 years, 80 years. Going back to say World War II at least. The United States government and military has relied on the private sector to manufacture its wartime capacity and capability at a large scale for decades, So to me, with Palantir, and I want to preempt this with, like, I'm not a huge fan of the military industrial complex. I think it's there's a ton of problems with the way things are set up with lobbyists and big government contracting companies and the kind of incestuous nature between politicians and board members of those companies. But the reality is you need that open marketplace and the ingenuity and the kind of genius engineering of small private companies to develop these technologies for us to be both competitive and successful in combat. And from my perspective, at least, giving Palantir secret access to certain operations tactics, et cetera, is no different than Boeing, making fighter jets for us. It's the same thing. We have processes and protocols put in place to, do background checks and have security clearances on those people. And, it's not a fail-proof system, but I think it's a thorough and as good of a system as we can employ to not over-regulate to the point where you're stifling the ability to innovate rapidly enough to stay relevant on the battlefield, to where, like, it's not a concern I have. Maybe I'm naive to it, but again, I view it like Boeing, McDonnell Douglas, whoever, or tank manufacturers, missile manufacturers, whoever makes the Tomahawk missile, it's probably one of those two, for all I know, or Raytheon, who knows, but to me, it's all essentially the same thing.
I think the worry that a lot of people have is, again, like these technologies are, for one, I feel like it's the first time that the public's really getting a little bit more of a deeper insight, a little bit deeper view on what are the possibilities with some of these, whether that be social media, whether that be that there hasn't been such a massive change in advancements and everything that it just hasn't been as relevant. But again, like seeing the Eagle Eye video come out from Anduril where, the guy, his screen pops up, you can see people behind walls essentially. Some of the stuff that Palantir, where their AI systems are able to process, things that would take days before in a matter of seconds. Like, these technologies just seem so powerful that I think a lot of individuals that don't have as much experience and everything may be looking at this and, saying like, these are getting very powerful, very fast. Like, what are the implications of that,
Yeah, I don't disagree with that entirely. Where I wouldn't even say push back, but I would just kind of reiterate is that, the longbow at the time seemed hard to even wrap your mind around. The Gatling gun, the first automatic machine gun, the first drone that was able to fire a Hellfire missile remotely, from 30,000 feet. I mean, I think along the way, every piece of technology that, 100 years ago to us is archaic, but at the time it was cutting edge and completely, changed the way the battlefield space looks and how your tactics are employed. So, again, I'll say I don't disagree with, it does seem like the leaps and bounds of the advancement seems more pronounced than maybe in history. But I think all of the same principles apply in terms of how you're developing it, who you're allowing to develop it, what information you're giving them. One of the most effective ways, at least in my opinion, to combat potential security problems is the compartmentalization of intelligence, is that whole need to know thing. Is that even within Palantir, as an example, like this group knows this because that's what they need to know, but they don't know about what these other 4 branches and they don't have the ability to communicate or not allowed or, whatever. There's, of course, nefarious actors. There are spies. There are, saboteurs, that are always trying to angle and get into those organizations. And it's our government's job to mitigate that and gatekeep it. And they should and do that to the best of their ability. They're not perfect, but I just kind of view it more as it's the same, but I do see the perception that it is kind of advancing faster than what we've seen.
Yeah, it's kind of funny you bring up the spy angle too. I mean, continuing to talk about China. God, when was this? When DeepSeek came out? I want to say it was like early 2024. DeepSeek's one of the models that popped out of China, and it was very similar to ChatGPT at that time. I think it was like 3.5. And essentially what happened is they had somebody in-house that took a lot of their training data, brought it over there, and now they can make models significantly cheaper, like millions and millions of dollars less, pump it out for use. And then now that people are feeding it information for free, starts training on that data. It feels like we kind of entered, and I've said like the AI chip war, AI Cold War. Do you think there's just a whole new explosion of espionage that we should be on the lookout for?
I don't know that I would call it a whole new level of espionage because it's always been that way. And it's not just in military technology or national security applications. I mean, look at Tesla. China for decades, look at the electric cars they're producing now. And, they I think used kind of the 3M mantra, which is we didn't make the fill in the blank, we made the fill in the blank better. Not necessarily that they're even making it better, but they're, the unfortunate reality is that they have the benefit of piggybacking off of the capital that it takes for research and development to engineer from scratch these technologies that didn't exist before. And they can take that and now, use a fraction of that, but through volume of engineers, take a thing that's already on third base and get it to home plate, but we've always had to deal with that. So I don't think it's really anything new or that there's this like resurgence or insurgence of much more, spy or sabotage type of capabilities. It's always been there. It's always going to be there. And it's always something that we need to look out for and do our best to protect. I think it also highlights, and now we'll come full circle and come back to manufacturing. It just further, or I would say, that is the highlight of when we talk about kind of the broad brush of national security of why manufacturing matters. Like that is why it matters, is that exact problem. So I do think that we should be better about some of the technologies that we sell to other countries militarily, whether it's fighter jets to Saudi Arabia or, anything like that. I think, I do think we kind of dropped the ball in that way because once they have it, they can pick it apart. They can send them to China. I mean, once it's out of your hands, man, like they can do whatever they want with it, so I wish that we were more staunch in who we sold weapons to. I get that, our government and those companies want to make billions of dollars, and they do tens of billions or hundreds of billions. But I can see that being problematic and juice not being worth the squeeze monetarily.
Mm-hmm. This is going to be a pretty large scale question, but again, like,
well, I'm going to give you a large scale answer.
Well, both your live experiences, and then, seldom do I get to have someone else that also has a podcast and has been able to speak with tons of different individuals from different backgrounds and get various perspectives. In terms of the Cold War with China, what direction do you see this going? Do you see it more akin to how the Cold War ended in the 90s, where one of them kind of spurts out? Do you see it just being an ongoing two-party type system, or do you see it potentially getting, hot?
Yeah, I mean, the tough part is I can see a realistic version or scenario for each one of those examples, so it's now whether or not I would put 33 1/3% on each of those, I don't know. Or I guess I would say I would predict that I would lean more towards it will end up similar to the Cold War with Russia in the 80s and 90s, where the society that is China has shortcutted a lot of the things that we kind of put the hard work in, and no different than, maybe this is a shitty analogy, but it's kind of like a trust fund kid, like if his dad came from nothing and built this company into a, billion-dollar corporation and then hands it off to his son who grew up in satin sheets and eating caviar, it's going to be harder for him to maintain that same standard. And I think it is and will be for them too. I don't say that to discount their ability to do it. They very well could. But with the limitations and regulations that they put on their society, I don't think that they have, even though the pride quotient over there is a lot higher than it is here in the United States, I think that it's largely manufactured. And that a lot of average Chinese citizens have not kind of seen behind the curtain and been unimpressed with the wizard. Same thing with North Korea. I could be wrong. Just a hunch, I guess, but I could see the combination of that in that, not that they're a paper tiger, because they're not, but that the shortcuts and kind of the manufacturing of pride in a way where it was piggybacked off of another country in most ways, coupled with the fact that there's this weird, almost incestuous relationship that they have with us from a consumerism standpoint that makes it very difficult for them to even be able to attack us or destroy us as an entire population, because the ramifications and consequences that's going to enact on them financially and socioeconomically, at least right now, in my opinion, would be catastrophic to the point where it's going to deter them from doing it. And that's just on the purely economic side. You also have the nuke threat of, if they come at us so hard to where it's like we have no choice but to respond with everything we have, i.e. a nuclear capability. Obviously, they don't want that either, because then the planet loses, So them understanding that, I think, would lend it to my prediction of being the highest percentage outcome. The other two are certainly possible, but that's what if I was making odds in Vegas, I would put the odds on that outcome.
Let me play devil's advocate just a little bit. I don't know if devil's advocate's like the right word, but we were talking a lot about bringing manufacturing from China to the U.S., right? Is that a risk that we'd have to think about, that if we are moving manufacturing from there, that we are cutting some of those ties, that percentage starts to decrease a little bit, that they start becoming a little bit more vulnerable?
It's possible. Certainly something to consider. And I'm not saying that I think that couldn't have that impact. It could. As I kind of mentally work through that, I do think that there's an aspect of, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to slowly diminish. And just like, if they completely crush us economically to where that's going to have negative impacts on them, us doing it voluntarily is also going to have negative impacts on them, and ultimately is going to give them less of an ability or capability to attack us in that fashion. Mm-hmm. What I would still prefer is let's do that on our terms, right? Is that if we're saying, hey, we're closing up shop, we're building manufacturing plants here and bringing everything in-house, is that they don't really have much of a choice, or they have less of a choice in that scenario. And we can kind of, I would say, better control, not completely control, but better control kind of the levers that how we do that, how quickly or slowly we do that, and what possible or potential protections we put in place before we shut those valves completely off over there and open them wide open here. And like I said, I would rather us do that on our terms than on theirs. But
would you say our best weapon in these type of conflicts is capitalism itself?
Yeah, for sure. I think, history has shown us that, the most powerful tool for innovation, for economic stability, for quality of life, for general happiness as a society is free market and capitalism. It's not perfect, and I'm not saying that it is. I'm not saying that it doesn't have problems, especially when you start to look at, 7 deadly sins and religious type stuff, where there's greed and materialistic tendencies and corruptions of society because power and wealth are so interconnected. It's not fail-safe or without its flaws. But I think of all of the things that we've seen globally, historically, from implemented societal structures, to me, it seems like it's the best and most effective way for a society to conduct itself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of the idea. I mean, as you were working through and what you were talking about, it was like, the big idea of we won the Cold War when we put a McDonald's in Moscow. It's kind of the same deal with China. It's like them being our manufacturing hub, they're getting exposed to tons of westernized products and
ideas.
Yeah. And slowly but surely, comparing them to the 90s or, Mao Zedong era, they become so much more essentially capitalist. It's like, as long as we let that game continue to play, they kind of just evolve into something akin that we see with Russia today.
Agreed. Because I think they're kind of a hybrid of that. To your point, is that there has been such a economic relationship with them in a positive way. It's had plenty of negatives, but there have been some positives. In that, I do think it has changed and revolutionized their society to a certain extent. Why I would mention or kind of call them a hybrid is that if you look at North Korea, I think that's a great example of the non-hybrid. It's the polar opposite of what we are. And you look at where they're at, and they seem to be a pretty miserable society. When you look at the people who flee there. Now, granted, to be fair, anybody fleeing somewhere is not going to have a positive opinion of that place, or they wouldn't be fleeing there. So I'm not naive to that. But I think when you look at them as a threat, they're really not. And as a society, as an economic powerhouse, they're not anywhere near the same caliber of competitor that China or Russia is. And both Russia and China are far more westernized or somewhat capitalistic compared to what they were 20, 30, 40 years ago.
Were you surprised to see that news story that came out that there was going to be an operation in North Korea? I'm blanking a little bit on all the specific details, but
yeah, no. I mean, I think if we've learned anything over the last 20 years, is that the most secret military operation is hard to keep a secret. And with technology being what it is, think about your day-to-day life, think about in the 70s, the way mobsters and gang members or serial murderers or rapists, the freedom of movement that they had compared to now.
New Jersey's built on it.
Yeah. It's not comparable, I can't imagine that mobsters in New York and New Jersey are, doing the things that they did in the 70s because there are cameras everywhere, So that's just our day-to-day lifestyle. You think about how different it is from 30, 40 years ago. Now when you apply military covertness to that, it's amplified astronomically, and even more difficult to keep things covert when you have technology everywhere. You know, coupled with a society that the media is one of those. I'm not going to say it's an evil. To call it a necessary evil, I don't think it's inherently evil, but there are evil people in the media, you know, that have no concept of kind of morally or from a principled standpoint doing the right thing when it comes to that. It reminds me of Jurassic Park, strangely, and I promise there's a tie-in. You know, when Jeff Goldblum says, you know, it's very impressive what you've done here, but I think you've spent so much time, or we as a species have spent so much time trying to figure out whether or not we could or couldn't. We never stop to think whether or not we should or shouldn't. And I think most media outlets are that way, is that they're trying to uncover the story and they rarely think, should I actually say this? You know, under the guise of free speech, First Amendment, America deserves to know. I don't disagree with those things. But I also think that there are certain operations and things that the U.S. military does, not to say that there shouldn't be checks and balances, because there should. I don't know that the private sector civilian media is the best check and balance for covert military operations. And I think most times they will always err on the side of getting the story and getting clicks or views or publicity for uncovering something, even if it's maybe best that they don't.
Yeah, because I know a lot of times those operations, you know, I've had guys that have mentioned stuff offline that said, like, you know, we were in consideration to do such and such because of such and such reason. And it's like the media got that narrative. They'd love to run with it and say, oh, they were planning on doing this. And it's like, yes, but it was if X, Y, and Z happened and this was going to be our reaction. And we were just strategizing for all possibilities. It wasn't, you know, like the plan was in motion because we wanted to do this and then we just stopped last minute. Like oftentimes it's just all considerations always taken into fact.
Yeah, I mean, you know, any good military or Department of Defense has as many contingency plans as possible. You know, you can only what if so many things, but you should what if as many things as possible, so that should that what if actually happen, that you have thought about it and you have some sort of cohesive plan to deal with it. I mean, that's just good business as it relates to, you know, military operations. But yeah, a lot of times I think, you know, oh, there's an op plan for this scenario. That means the U.S. military was planning on executing this when they weren't. You know, it was, if this happens, then this is how we're going to respond. And yeah, I agree. I think they tend to run with those.
Yeah, I mean, it's a stupid example, but there was one where the U.S. military came out, maybe it was the Pentagon or something, came out with what their plan would be for a zombie apocalypse. And everyone was like, what are they trying to tell us? And I was like, guys, it was just a fun war game they were doing. Like, it doesn't have to be that serious.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, if there's an alien invasion op plan, it's like, wait, there's aliens? Maybe, you know, but probably not. I don't know. Maybe. We'll see. But yeah, I mean, you know, the sensationalism of journalism in so many genres is pretty wild.
Mm-hmm. Let's take one more break and then we'll jump back.
Yeah.
So looking at your military career, what first kind of sparked you to want to end up joining the military?
So growing up, both of my grandfathers were in World War II. My mom's dad was in the Navy, dad's dad was in the Army, and I found myself just being fascinated by it. You know, I more so than I think most kids, just wanting to hear the occasional war story or whatever. Like, there was just a reverence and an admiration I had for them and that generation and that time period. And to this day, I still do. Like, I find myself thinking, like, one of the questions I ask is, if time travel was possible, where and when would you go and why? And, you know, for me, like, the 40s and 50s would for sure be a place I'd love to spend some time. But that coupled with, I had a great childhood, you know, so many of I would say our guests, you know, military veterans and stuff, don't share that. They had pretty rough childhoods. I did not. I had a phenomenal family, still do. And, you know, parents were great, still together. And just very supportive. And even at an early age, kind of appreciated the opportunity that America is, and always wanted to serve my country kind of from a principled standpoint. And didn't really know what I wanted to do in the military. I just had this kind of urge to serve. But in high school, I read a Popular Mechanics article that had a big piece on the SEAL teams, and I had grown up competitively swimming. And when I read it, I was just like, that's what I want to do. It was a very catalyst light switch moment. So for the rest of high school, it's pretty singularly focused on just getting ready to go and join the Navy. I mean, I graduated high school at 17 and did the delayed entry program and had to wait until I turned 18 that summer. Went to boot camp right after I turned 18 and went right through SEAL training at 18. So it was something where I wouldn't say for the entirety of my childhood always wanted to join, but it was always a recurring theme. And then once I read that article and learned about the SEAL teams, coupled with my time that I had spent swimming so much, it just kind of made sense, was a natural fit, and went for it.
Looking back now, do you think the SEALs was the right choice, or would you have maybe?
I do, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, but just there's two things really. I mean, one, just the inherent closeness to maritime and waterborne operations made sense, and I liked that aspect of it. Coupled with the fact that, being a young teenager going through puberty and reading, this is the toughest U.S. military training in existence. Like, there's just an ego thing attached to that. Of course that's subjective. All special operations selections and trainings are incredibly difficult. I don't think it's fair or accurate to say that SEAL training is the hardest. They're all hard, but as a 14-year-old reading that, of course, I'm like, well, that's what I wanted. If that's the hardest, that's the one I want to do, So, but yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be where I'm at now. I'm incredibly happy and satisfied with what I've done thus far. And the SEAL teams is a big part of that.
Mm-hmm. What was your experience going through BUD/S?
Man, it was a cakewalk, No, it was a kick in the nuts, as you would expect, or as I expected. I wouldn't say that there was really anything that was super surprising. Like, I knew it was going to be tough. I knew Hell Week would be a challenge. There were a couple things, I guess, in that, I actually didn't have a high degree of confidence when I showed up, because I just looked around. I was like, I'm 18, I'm 5'11", 145 pounds, and I'm surrounded by D1 college athletes and, these dudes that are 6'2", 230 and, athletic Adonises, and, like, who the fuck am I? I have no life experience. I don't know how to shoot. I'm not a superb athlete. I mean, I was better than average, I would say, but I wasn't, a state champion wrestler or anything. And so I was kind of looking around just like, man, did I bite off more than I can chew here, or, what? And that very quickly dissipated when I started seeing those guys that I looked at like, man, I've got no chance if this guy's here, quit. And when I saw guys that I thought would either make it or last longer at least than I would, quit right in front of me doing the same thing that I was managing to survive, it was like this instant confidence boost. And very quickly, I wouldn't say that I got cocky or overly confident, but I felt that I was at least capable enough to make it if I just could survive and not quit. And so I wouldn't say that it was smooth sailing, but there weren't any major hiccups until the very last phase of training. I pinched my sciatic nerve really bad and then failed everything and got rolled in third phase to the next class. So I started with 214, got rolled in third phase with 215, picked 215 up and graduated with them. The last phase, so there's third phase and it's broken into two parts. There's the first 5 weeks or so, 4 weeks that's there at Coronado doing land nav and land warfare type stuff. But then you go out to San Clemente Island for a month. That was harder than I anticipated. Not that I thought it would be easy, but for me, that was probably the hardest part of training, just because it was 7 days a week, two and a half hours of sleep a night every single day. And it was really cold. We were there in January, February, and it was El Nino. And so the water was
the winter class.
Yeah, it was like, well, I mean, to me, like most of the time people will say a winter class is when you go through Hell Week if it's in the winter. I went through Hell Week in July. It still sucked. But if you go through Hell Week in the summertime, you're probably going to go through the island in the wintertime. And Hell Week is 6 days. The island is 32, so the water was like 50 degrees, and we were in it a lot, and it was brutal, but you're so close to graduation, you just kind of put your head down and stay at it and manage to make it through. But, it was kind of the worst, best time of my life. I look back on it fondly, a lot of great memories, amazing men that I served with and went through training with. And I'm just very grateful to have been able to do it.
Yeah. The way you kicked it off too, it's funny. I hear that time and time again from guys where it's like, they look around at the guys that are around them and, they immediately kind of get that imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And then it's that first mental hurdle of if you outlast one of those guys and realize, it's not about the physical attributes, but it's a lot about the mental. And if you're able to push through that, it's like it allows them to kind of get that push forward. Mm-hmm. It's like time and time and again, I hear that. And it's amazing how much it's really about the mental battle than just the physical attributes.
It's huge, and because so much of SEAL training and all special operations selection courses is such a mental battle. That plays a significant role for sure in building confidence and giving you kind of the internal belief in yourself to keep going.
Mm-hmm. So then after graduation, you were placed with Team 3, right?
Correct.
Yep. I guess, what was that experience like? And then also, did that feel like the right fit?
It was awesome. Yes, it felt like the right fit. And back then, each team had a very different personality. This was before a complete reorganization of the entire SEAL community. And I won't bore listeners with the details, but back then, like SEAL Team 3 was the desert warfare platoon. Team 5 was jungle. Team 1 was cold weather and Europe and jungle. And all the teams kind of had their specialty. And I think it was better back then because there was that subject matter expertise in those operations, because jungle warfare and being very good at that is wildly different than being good at desert warfare. Mm-hmm. Cold weather, same thing, and when the reorg happened and every team kind of was more of a jack of all trades, master of none, I think we lost some of our specialty that way. But it was still, it was an amazing experience because I was 19, and I was surrounded by 200, grown men that, lived it, for decades. And to be in a position where, you're kind of on the job mentored around a group of guys like that. You can't pay for that kind of upbringing and influence. My parents did a phenomenal job laying a foundation, and I feel like the SEAL teams finished turning me into a man because I served from 18 to 30, and so that window of time was pretty critical. And to be surrounded by guys who, were hard on you, but showed you how to do it and do it right, and do it right every time, with incredibly high standards, and making you prove yourself every single day and never getting comfortable or complacent. It really shaped me into being able to come out of the military and be successful at whatever I wanted to do.
Do you think it'd be healthy for them to explore bringing back some of that personalized specialties for the team?
I do, but like with everything, there are pros and cons. The pros to what they did is, from a capability standpoint, as a special operations entity, allowed us to be able to go anywhere and do anything, just not as high of a level, or be able to do it with more people. Now, you could argue that because of Iraq and Afghanistan, pretty much the entire SEAL community turned into a desert warfare community for 20 years because of that. So it's almost irrelevant in that way. Had peacetime continued, relative peacetime. Maybe the effects would have been different, but that shaped our entire military for 20 years in a way that, relative peacetime just absolutely wouldn't. So, I would like to see it go back to that, because I do think that, even if a scenario exists where, let's say, a jungle combat environment pops up, right now, the entire SEAL community is going to have to relearn a lot of those lessons. Now, even if only one or two of the SEAL teams specialize in that, you at least have SEALs who can bring the rest of the community up to speed a hell of a lot faster than reinventing that wheel. To me, that would be preferred. Doesn't mean that there isn't the downside of not having a more kind of conventional general application special operations force, but I do think that that's the better way to go about it, and I wish they would do that. I don't think they will, but yeah, I would like to see that.
Yeah, when I had Ben Wallach on, he mentioned that. He was like, when we first went into Iraq, Afghanistan, it was a bit of a surprise. He's like, a lot of them had not really trained for that type of warfare, that dynamic. And then he's like, we had to relearn a lot of tactics or rediscover, but then the cons of that is that everyone kind of becomes siloed into that specific type. And it's like, I feel like it would be awesome for the teams to have their still, have a little bit of that jack of all trades training and everything, but also have a little bit more of you guys are subject matter experts in this specific environment at this time.
Yeah, I agree. I think that that's the better way to approach it in the long term and from a big picture standpoint. But the Navy decided otherwise, so it kind of stuck with it.
So this was all before 9/11, correct?
Well, I mean, it's the training, and when I first went to Team 3, yes, I did one deployment prior to 9/11. So
where were you on 9/11? How was that?
Yeah, so I was on my way to SEAL Team 3. I was in a SEAL platoon. I was driving down Interstate 5 in San Diego, headed to work when it happened. And at the time, I was living up north about 30 or 40 minutes from the base. So from the time I left until the time I got there, the entire base shut down, basically. And it, it was an absolute nightmare security-wise. At that point, as a society or as a military, we knew that the country was under attack. And of course, we had no idea if other things were going to be taking place or whatever. So the level of security to get on the base was nuts, and it took all day for us to get there. Once we got there, there was an unspoken heaviness and gravity to what had happened, like there was with everybody. But the understanding, the silent understanding that we all had that this was different, obviously, and things were about to change very significantly for all of us. But we were all, I felt like, very ready and felt, called to go get some, basically.
Mm-hmm. How quickly were you guys brought in on, who the possible actors behind the attack were? I
mean, immediately, we all had, I would say, a much higher general understanding intelligence-wise than your average citizen. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, everybody kind of knew right away, like, it was Al-Qaeda, it's bin Laden, whatever. But, and there's, plenty of debate even today as to whether or not that's even the case, which there's been some compelling and interesting information that's come out even here fairly recently. Tucker Carlson's done a whole series on it. I don't know if you've watched it.
Deep diving.
Yeah. So it's hard to know. There's like I said, there's been enough compelling counter arguments to where it's hard to know, what's what at this point. So I'm not naive to think that there isn't more to the story. I'm sure there is. I don't know that we'll ever know the full details of it. But either way, for us at that time, it was very singularly focused, front sight focused, Afghanistan, Al-Qaeda, bin Laden, like we're going to go get some. And so that was pretty much the just throttle wide open, all of our training and kind of exercises and, fake intel packages for training were all kind of centered around that as an understanding operationally.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned the Tucker Carlson coming out with that documentary and everything, and kind of doing a deep dive. Kind of stems back to the beginning of the show. We were talking about it's difficult for a lot of Americans to feel comfortable really with any operation these days because everything kind of has that underlying what if factor, what's the truth behind any of these situations. It's just causes a lot of issue, and a lot of it does stem from that. And it's like whether the entire truth has been out since then or we still don't know the truth. It's like there's always going to be that debate in people's minds,
Yeah, it's tough because the U.S. government and every facet of it have shaken, I would say, all Americans, or at least most Americans' trust and belief in them, broadly speaking, and even specifically to what they tell us and, the way they explain what happened, how it happened, who's responsible. There's enough unanswered things and, let's say, points of contention to make, I think, anybody with any type of, logic or reason-based thinking to where they're going to question a lot of what they're told, myself included.
So what was your first deployment like for post 9/11 once you guys actually started going out that direction?
Yeah, so I did an exercise in Jordan right after 9/11 where it was labeled as an exercise, but was more of kind of a forward staging ground in case we needed to go into Afghanistan, or at least that's what we were pitched, is that, hey, this is an exercise, but we're bringing our full go-to-war loadout, and if we need to do anything, we'll be ready to go and already be in Jordan. So nothing happened. We ended up just doing the exercise and pre-staging essentially for nothing. But then I came back, and then we'd gotten switched to a Southeast Asia deployment because, the reality is, even though Afghanistan was going on, there's still a lot of other things. There's a lot of Al-Qaeda sympathizing affiliates all over the world, the Philippines being one of them. And so that was kind of our focus, which we were upset about. But so we started as a Southeast Asia deployment, went to the Philippines, did some global war on terror cross-training with Filipino SEALs that were fighting the Abu Sayyaf and Moro Islamic Liberation Front down in Mindanao, the southern part of the Philippines, which is a heavy Al-Qaeda Islamic affiliate.
Were you guys seeing any combat while you were over there, or was it mostly just kind of training?
It was all facilitating training. In fact, the Philippine government at that time would not allow American forces to go on any actual direct combat missions. So, but as we were midway through deployment, Iraq started spinning up, and so they ended up sending us to Kuwait and then going into Iraq ultimately, even though we had slated to be in Southeast Asia the whole time. So we ended up going on the initial invasion in Iraq and doing the gas and oil platforms a couple nights before the war started, which was the single largest special operations mission in U.S. history and still is to this day, which was pretty cool. And it was dicey because, it was a pretty complex target. We'd received a lot of intelligence that did not make us feel good about the environment that we were going into. And it was one of those, well, you're going anyway, type of things, and it needs to get done. And so we did it. It went well. And there's a manifold metering station that half our SEAL team took down on the coastline. And then there was about 30 miles of 48-inch pipes full of oil going out to the oil platform that the rest of our team and the Polish GROM collectively took down, and managed to keep it from getting blown and having an environmental disaster with oil spillage. Captured 26 Iraqi Republican Guard troops, and yeah, it went fairly well. And then went back to the Kuwaiti Naval Base, drove up to Ali Salim Air Force Base, and then drove into Iraq as the invasion was going on. Drove up to Nasiriyah, spent some time there doing kind of blue gold or AB missions where, we would go out one night and be the assault force and Other platoons would be our QRF in a helo standing by doing racetracks above if we needed them. Then the next night we'd swap. They would go out and we would QRF, quick reaction force for those listening that don't know. There were some missions that we would all go on together because we needed more troops. Did that for a while because the Marines were taking pretty heavy casualties in Nasiriyah along a main supply route. And so we did a bunch of counter ambush stuff and it was pretty fun. Then we went up to just south of Baghdad, did a little bit of kind of the same stuff there, then went up into northern Baghdad, hit a Scud base, a Scud training base, and took that down and secured it. And then we went up into Tikrit, which was Saddam's hometown. We took his palace down, got ambushed real bad the night before. Took his palace down, set up shop, and ran operations out of there, doing sniper overwatch and assaults in the city of Tikrit for the subsequent time and the rest of the deployment. And then bagged ass out and flew home from there. So,
what was, in terms of whether this is like specific story or anything, but was there anything that surprised you in terms of combat with the National Guard and that, where the Iraqi National Guard were there? Because I think it's such an interesting juxtaposition of like the type of combat of facing a more traditional military in the sense versus obviously as insurgency picked up and it became more Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc. Like, what were the combat expectations? And I guess, was it kind of what you expected going in?
Yeah, I mean, so expectation-wise, on the one hand, I didn't know what to expect because we hadn't been to Iraq before and fought them as an enemy. Having said that, I was the intelligence representative for the platoon, so I had a pretty significant finger on the pulse as to what was going on and kind of what to expect from a capability standpoint. In terms of, where those expectations versus reality didn't line up, I would say there weren't a bunch of things that I was surprised by. I think probably largely because I was the intel rep, but it was interesting to see some instances of them fighting really hard and being very dedicated, and others where there was zero dedication, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot of rhyme or reason. Probably just, outfit to outfit, some guys gave a shit and some didn't. Some it was a paycheck and they had a family to feed and it wasn't worth it. And other guys, whether they were relatives of Saddam or loyalists, nationalists, whatever, and really wanted to fight hard and did, maybe it's that simple. I'm not sure. But that was probably the biggest surprise, was just some it was heavy resistance, some it was very little. And it just kind of ebbed and flowed that way throughout the whole time there.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the actual combat, like, did they tend to actually operate a little bit more tactically? I don't know if that's like more traditional in the sense versus, again, like, I imagine a lot of times, and from what I've heard with guys, like when they're fighting a lot of the insurgent fighters, like it's a little bit more randomized or.
Yeah, I would say it was generally more non-traditional or non-conventional that way. I mean, there was some conventional aspects of some of the fighting, but most of it was more insurgency type stuff where smaller pockets, very guerrilla warfare like, kind of expect the unexpected, and you're doing more reactive fighting, or more than you would like to do. Ideally you don't want to be reacting to anything. You want to dictate the time, the place, the pace, everything. And sometimes we did and sometimes we didn't, but yeah.
So before moving on here, I do want to check in on Saddam's palace, just for those who maybe haven't heard. I mean, what was the perspective of seeing something kind of at that scale? And obviously I know there was tons of a level of wealth and kind of a level of substance there that was just pretty unique. So what was that experience like?
It was exactly that. I mean, even knowing that that's what you're going to see, is still being pretty overwhelmed with kind of the opulence that his palace possessed. I mean, the intricacy of, some of the tile work and some of the mosaic work and stained glass work, and just, the fit and finish and detail was just on such a level that it was like biblical almost, And so, it was impressive and, definitely life-changing as far as like something I'll never forget, and just finding myself being grateful that we're in this position to even do something like this. But it also highlighted the disparity between probably 1% of the population there and the other 99. Like, to say that there's not a middle class, I think is even a woeful misunderstatement. There's the very, very high elite, which are obnoxiously wealthy. And then everybody else is, pretty third world. There's not much of a middle class there. And to see that amount of wealth and resource put into one of his palaces that he didn't even spend much time at, kind of highlighted the bastard that he was, and the plague that he kind of, I think, enacted on his own people. But it was neat to see, that's for sure.
Yeah, it's weird. The perspective of him too is like, I'm very big on watching travel videos, like of people that go around the world, just because, I don't get to go to a lot of these places, obviously. Yeah. So getting experiencing it from like a third party view, one of the most interesting ones is they talked about Saddam became more ideological and power and everything. He started to think that he was the reincarnation of the Babylonian king, and that he was supposed to bring back Babylon.
Yeah.
And that led him to doing like a lot of over-eccentric stuff. And it's so crazy in the modern world to be able to see that there's climates like that, there's communities like that, there's leaders like that do these type of things in countries that I think in the U.S. would just be so foreign to, again, as you highlighted, it's almost biblical in the sense of the way they're approaching it.
Yeah, for sure, and that's, I think, one of the key components to a lot of other regions, in the world, not just the Middle East, but, there are certainly other parts of the globe where, the tyrannical dictatorship and state-run media and controlled dictator-like lives that these countries are kind of oppressed by lend itself to being able to pull that off, and I would say it's a feather in the cap for democracy, in that, it's going to be much more difficult for something like that to happen when there's a more free society. I wouldn't say entirely free. I don't think the United States is as free as we like to think it is, but it's night and day difference from a place like that, so weird to see and sobering and humbling for sure. It was wild to see the culture and the way that country was run for decades prior to us showing up.
Mm-hmm. This might be a difficult question, but if you had to pick one thing specifically out of all what was in the palace and the artwork, or I guess some of the trophies and stuff, what was kind of the most?
Probably the ceiling, strangely enough, in that there were different portions of the palace that had, as you looked up, it was, Michelangelo level of talent almost, but in 1/4-inch by 1/4-inch tiles, hand-painted tiles that were then hand-laid to depict these murals that from a certain distance looked like they were paintings, but as you got closer, you could tell that they were 1/4-inch tiles that were colored, that were made to look into images that were, I was blown away by it. The whole thing, there's marble and gold and brass and shit everywhere, but to me, that kind of stood out as being the most impressive part of what I saw.
So you left country right after you guys spent time there. And then from there, did you have another deployment out?
I didn't. So I went back. My time at Team 3 was up, so I went to advanced training to put students that had just graduated buds. There's a kind of an intermediate training pipeline called SEAL qualification training. I went to be an instructor there to kind of bring back the lessons from from Iraq to the new crop of students. And when I was there, I got sick with valley fever, coccidioidomycosis, lost 40% of my lung capacity, and was almost medically retired. They tried to medically retire me, and I just kind of worked out a backroom deal to keep me in the military for another 3-year enlistment, to where they sent me to Buds to be a SEAL instructor for that remaining 3 years, where had both of my kids, got my college degree, and then punched out after that. And I was offered a position as a canine handler at the West Coast Multipurpose Canine Unit as I was getting out, but I did not feel confident physically in my ability to not be a liability because of my lungs. And so I ended up getting out and starting the dog training company.
When did the interest in dog training start to peak up? I mean, I know you've said that you had like a lifelong love for dogs, but was it around that time?
Yeah, so on deployment, there was a Morin explosive detection dog that was in our area that I just heard about. It wasn't even something that I witnessed, but that was my light switch, where we had never had the opportunity to work with dogs. I'd always been a big dog guy. Excuse me. And for me, that was kind of like this is what I want to do, kind of like reading the Popular Mechanics article, realizing that we were starting to use canines, and integrating them into special operations was, I was just like, man, I can't get enough of that. And so as soon as I got back, I just dove head first into, I already had some level of competency dog training wise, but it was very elementary at that point. But I just spent years doing as much as I could in the working dog world, whether it was seminars, volunteering with working units, just picking the brains of police and military dog trainers, going to vendors that sold dogs to police and military and seeing that whole process of how they select and import and evaluate dogs and train. And I've been doing it ever since.
What, when your college degree, what did you end up studying?
Criminal justice.
Criminal justice. Okay. I was curious. How do you feel that applied well towards kind of like business and also starting up kind of your own dog training facility?
It didn't. Yeah. I would say it was woefully uncompatible, with one exception. The one thing I will say is that it refined my ability to communicate fairly well, just because the amount of papers that you write, especially with criminal justice, because so much of it is gray area where you're making an argument for or against a case, and so much of it was that it just I would say helped or refined my ability to communicate better. So that was helpful. That's really about it, though.
Were you considering going like criminal justice route? Is that why you kind of went that direction, or just interested?
Sort of. I would say like it was more of I wanted to get a degree so that I at least have one when I get out. This interests me the most, and if I or should I decide that I want to do some sort of federal law enforcement, then this would be helpful for that, and that was really it. But my passion was dogs, and so I got it more as like a backup than this is what I'm doing to get out. It was more of I might as well take advantage of the GI Bill and my shore duty time as an instructor to go to school and knock it out before I actually separate from the military.
There's a lot of opportunity there too. So I guess starting off with dog training, because again, I think this is like a kind of a niche area that I'm sure a lot of people don't really have, a lot of insight to. What does the process actually look like of training kind of a military dog? I'm sure that's a super generalized question, but.
Well, it's I would say it is, but it's also a pretty general process too. Obviously, there's nuance from unit to unit, and application is going to dictate that training process. So, the difference between like a military working dog that's standing at an entry gate on a military base is going to be quite a bit different than a special operations dual purpose explosive detection patrol dog. A lot of what you're looking for in a dog is going to be similar, not exactly the same, but you want a dog that frankly mirrors a lot of the characteristics and personality traits that a good special operator or a good military member has. But the key is having really high standards, finding the right dog for that position, and then, implementing the training pipeline, just like I was talking about, getting from point A to point B, winning a war. Here's where we're at. Green dog, not a lot of training, has all the raw genetic traits that we need to do the work. Point B is a finished product that you can hand leash off to a handler and he deploys. And then you're executing that training plan, and that's going to be dictated by what the operational capacity needs to be.
Could you walk us through the process of what that would look like for a special forces dog? Because I feel like that's probably, in terms of capabilities, I'd imagine that's like one of the more
high level.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So you really need a very well-rounded dog. A lot of people hear that, special operations dog, and they think, this dog has to be Cerberus or, the three-headed dog that, is guarding Satan's gate or whatever. You actually need a dog that's pretty social and amicable to be around strangers and not bite them for no reason and whatever, because that dog's going to be in a lot of situations where he's around people, shoved into an armored personnel carrier, or blacked out helicopter at night, banking hard, or, going into a target house where there's explosions going off and gunfire and, insurgents shooting at you and yelling and chaos and what have you. In that same vein, you need a dog that's incredibly confident, supremely confident, like everywhere he goes, he feels like he owns the place, but is also incredibly environmentally stable, because you're going to be putting him in very challenging environments constantly that are changing, that you can't predict. And so you've got to be really thorough in that selection process to ensure that dog has high levels of confidence, environmentally incredibly stable, really high prey drive, really high hunt drive, and then a natural forward aggression towards human beings that's manageable. Needs to be as high as you can find while still being manageable, because if it's not manageable, now you have a chainsaw on legs that's just fucking everybody up and is a big liability. So you need all of those at a 10 out of 10 level in that dog.
How are you diagnosing those? Like, is it very early in their first couple months of life? Like, is that when you're starting to diagnose? Is it giving them a little bit of time to mature?
Yes and no. I mean, you are, but you obviously have to understand that it's an 8-week or 10-week or 15-week-old puppy. And so you want to see what's realistic to show that at that age, which is going to be obviously very pared back from what that dog's going to show you at 18 months. And so it's a constant evolving and evaluation. And you're basically making sure that all of those things are there appropriately for the age of the dog as they get older. If you see any of those go away, you wash the dog out and it doesn't make the cut. We usually get dogs when they're 18 months, to 2 years, somewhere in that range, because, we don't have the 2 years to sit on that and hope that the dog ends up being what he looked like at 10 weeks old. So we'll run them through that selection process to identify all of those traits at 18 to 22, 24 months old, with one caveat that the dog also needs to be mentally mature, which obviously a puppy's not going to possess. The training that we're going to conduct, the scenarios that we're going to put that dog in, requires that the dog is not just confident for his age, but that it's hardwired genetically that dog is mentally mature to be able to handle the stress that we're going to put him through in selection and in training, and then ultimately in deployment. So, we're going to test dogs in that, late adolescent, early adult frame where we know they're mentally mature, that they can handle all of the testing and training, and look at them then. And if they have all of that, then we bring them in. Once we have them in, that's where being very selective is really important, because we don't want to spend a few months and then realize it's not the right dog and wash them out and have to start over. So I'll usually be a little harder on them early on to make sure it's gonna make the cut. And then we go through the process. That process takes generally 12 to 18 months. Excuse me.
Let's see.
Yeah, sorry. Generally that process takes 12 to 18 months or so, putting them through all the kind of wickets that they need to go through, training for explosive detection, for searching for people, for biting people, tracking, trailing, all of the auxiliary stuff like, jumping, fast roping, rappelling, etc., patrolling in and out, doing assaults, all of the kind of mock missions that we're going to be utilizing the dog in an operational capacity, and make sure that dog is nails, the same way you would with a SEAL platoon. So the training pipeline really mirrors the SEAL training pipeline, where, you know, the selection first, okay, you're the right dog for the right job. Now we're going to put you through all of the kind of skill sets that you need to be able to do on deployment before you actually deploy.
Mm-hmm. Do you tend to quickly know as you're training those dogs so I guess if I was to make the direct comparison, kind of what you just mentioned with the SEAL teams, like, are they in classes where it's like, this is the special forces group, this is a group that maybe will be doing more first response or anything like that? Like,
yeah, no, it's all special operations. So, you know, Lackland down in San Antonio is the military working dog base. Mm-hmm. So all regular non-special operations or conventional force military working dogs go through that pipeline handler course. It's a huge operation. Every special operations unit has its own multi-purpose canine program that's in-house, has their own trainers, their own handlers, their own facilities, their own training pipeline, the whole thing that's specific to that unit and what they're doing. And so while it's going to be very similar, you know, what the Rangers are doing with their dogs and we're doing with our dogs, it's all going to be very similar. The nuance and difference is going to be, you know, they're going to be focused more on what they specialize in, whereas we're going to do what we do, but it's a lot of the same stuff.
In terms of training a dog for bomb detection, I mean, how does that process actually work? I know, of course, they have a magnitude times better senses than us, but just what is training them to really be able to identify those smells? And also, I mean, I imagine, again, you're dealing with some of the most intelligent breeds, that they'd also be able to understand, like, they're in intense situations quite often.
Yeah.
You know, how does that process work?
So the tough part is that process, you know, I could probably spend 2 hours, you know, kind of going through the soup to nuts, you know, how to get it done. And, you know, like teaching a course for, you know, military or police, you know, it's a couple of days of kind of walking through that. So I'll abbreviate it, but cover as much as kind of the 30,000 foot view as I can. Is that, you know, one of the elements of the testing and selection is ensuring that a dog has really high prey and hunt drive. And what that means is that the dog will do anything to play with a ball or a tug, including hunt with his nose for it. So, you know, throwing it out into deep grass and holding him back, spin him around a couple times, let him go. Does that dog use his nose and the wind and kind of air scent his way to find it, or does he just look for it? You know, a dog that uses his eyes isn't going to work. I can't overstate the level of highness in terms of prey and hunt drive that's required for that kind of work. It's got to be obnoxious, you know, where the dog will even get aggressive, will bite through your hand to get to a ball, will jump out of a window. I mean, will do anything to get, possess, find, and play with that ball, because that is the reward that he's going to get to do. So it needs to be at such a level he's willing to spend minutes or even tens of minutes searching for that target odor, in this case explosive, so that he gets to play with that ball. So that's the driver. The mechanism to actually imprint that odor, I would say, is too long and complicated to walk through entirely on this episode. But the short of it is that we're taking whatever that target odor is, in this case it's explosives, but it doesn't matter, you know, to the dog. And it's important to understand that the dog doesn't know that he's looking for dynamite. He's looking for a vapor pressure that's specific to dynamite, and that signature odor that dynamite has, that you've shown him that if he finds that, he gets to play with the ball. So the process, whether it's drugs, explosives, bed bugs, cell phones, whatever, it's all the exact same process. Obviously, the medium with which you're searching for it is going to vary depending on where you're having that dog search for those things. But imprinting the odor is all very similar, and there are a number of different ways to do it. Different trainers adhere to different methods. There's a number of them, and again, it's kind of beyond the scope of this to get into them. But in short, it's essentially taking that odor, having it in a container that is not contaminated, bringing that dog in that odor cone so that there's some sort of wind creating, if you think of a flashlight, you know, the heavier the wind, the tighter the beam is. Mm-hmm. A gentle breeze, it's going to be more like that. So you're walking the dog through that odor cone. You see this head snap, The dog goes, finds where the source of that odor is, and then you teach him a final indication. For explosives, it's usually sitting, in some cases downing. I like to sit because when they down, they usually lean forward. If it's a pressure plate and the dog leans forward and hits it, that's a problem. A lot of older school narcotics dogs will bark, or they'll do what's called an active alert barking, or even scratching at it for vehicles. If the dog finds weed in the glove box, he paws at the glove box. Obviously, you don't want to teach an explosive detection dog an active alert. So whatever alert you want to teach the dog, standing and staring or sitting is my favorite. Once you teach him that and shape that, then you mark and reward it, and then he gets to play with his ball. And so that's kind of the super condensed Reader's Digest version, but that is the process.
So it's basically a reward system of, you find this, you get to play with the ball. Yeah,
and you're doing that in kind of a pseudo classroom type of setting, a very benign area with not a lot of distractions, a perfectly fenced in rectangle or square. Odors on the outside of the fence so that they can't get to it, so that you can shape and teach that final indicator, rewarding it, and then proofing him off those odors, putting other odors that are interesting but that you don't want him to find, so you can teach him to ignore. Because obviously if you take him into a house, there's a pantry, there's maybe another animal, there's kids' toys. I mean, there's all kinds of shit laying around that if you haven't proofed the dog off of those distractors, it's going to cause huge problems in an operational environment. And then you transfer that into real world training, where now you're doing vehicles, you're doing warehouses, you're doing, assault targets, you're doing, anything and everything you can imagine, open tree lines. I mean, you name it. If you're doing a patrol dog, where not patrol from a bite work sense, but patrolling into an area, IED detection is a huge thing. So planting, IEDs, fake IEDs, uninitiated IEDs in the ground so that the dog can find those, so that in a real world operation, he can, mark and identify that there's an IED up ahead or whatever. So.
Are they able to make distinctions between, again, obviously I know their senses are significantly better than humans, like gunpowder, if they're looking to detect that, like, are they able to, obviously in like a high intense shootout, like there'll be that smell all around. Are they able to prioritize if they need to smell something like very specific, whether it's locating explosives, locating, ammo depot, anything like that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the unique thing about a dog's olfactory coupled with the way the universe works, scent wise, is that everything has an odor, a signature or specific odor to it, and a vapor pressure or a kind of an intensity of that odor. And so, the short answer is you can teach a dog to find pretty much anything, which is why they can train dogs to find cell phones in prison systems, or hard drives hidden in people's bedrooms for child porn and stuff like that, or sensitive information. I mean, there's usually a signature chemical in everything that you can reduce it down to its most fundamental odor and train the dog on that, and then he'll find it, which is why like hiding drugs in coffee and shit like that doesn't work, because, if you and I walk into Pizza Hut, we smell pizza. When a dog walks into Pizza Hut, he smells every single ingredient by itself on that pizza, including every herb that's in the sauce, every spice that's on the sausage, the different types of cheeses. I mean, he can segregate every single individual odor in his nose that way, which is why they're so effective.
That's crazy. Does that work similar for if they're attacking? So if, like, let's say, they're on a combat deployment, anything like that, and they're going to take down a threat. Like, is it scent driven? Is it visually driven? Like, how do they recognize that's a bad individual?
It's a combination of three main components. One is scent. Typically Region's body odor is different. Everybody has their own signature body odor, but the way Iraqi men smell versus American soldiers is noticeably different, even for you and I. For the dog, it's night and day difference. So scent is part of it. Visual is part of it. The way they dress is part of it. But even contextually, or within that context, that's where training comes in. So if the dog has, for 400 iterations, gone on a raid where he's, in the stack, and there's somebody behind a couch or barricaded behind sandbags or in a tree line or whatever, all of the kind of typical positions that the adversary is going to be in, and the dog is used to seeing that, you can kind of condition them to understand who's bad and who's not. There's also an intent that dogs are masterful at reading. A lot of people think of it like smelling fear or considering it like a sixth sense. I tend to lean more into dogs are just very, very good at reading body language, far better than we are. And a quick kind of anecdote to that is, we're very verbal. If you think about, the amount of time we've been sitting down, think about the amount of information that we've exchanged with one another. How big of a role has our body language played in what we've told each other?
Yeah, nothing.
Like nothing.
Just sat right here.
That's how humans communicate, right? Now try to put yourself in a position where we don't have that ability, right? Like doesn't
foreign
exist.
language or anything like that.
But even within the body language cues, like if you and I went to the local Walmart, right, and we're sitting in my truck, and you see a guy that we can't hear him, see him, smell him, never met him in our life, but he's having the worst fucking day of his life, and he's walking across the parking lot, you could tell.
Yeah.
Right. Versus the guy that just won the lottery walking out, or, his wife told him, he's going to get lucky when he gets home. The way he's walking through the parking lot, you and I can tell vastly different, right? Mm-hmm. So think about that now from the dog's perspective, is that if it's that easy for you and I, who our overwhelming means of communication is verbally, like we just established, but we can still identify that amount of information from body language and nonverbal cues. Now imagine a dog who does not have the ability to verbally exchange information the way we do. Imagine how much better they are at identifying nonverbal communication in people. They are masters at it. They make us look like we're blind by comparison. Protection dogs are a good example of that. Somebody who means harm, who's walking up on the street, the dog picks up on that from a mile away. It's not that he can smell anger or fear or whatever. It's that when human beings are angry, they do things. When they're violent, they do things. When they're happy, they do things. When they're sad, they do things. They're very subtle. But dogs pick up on those from a mile away. And so, that is part of it, and so when you put all those together, they're very, very effective at going into a dynamic, chaotic, pitch black target and finding the bad guy and fucking him up.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense too, because they've evolved alongside us for literally thousands of years.
Yeah.
In some way or form, they have to be able to pick up communication because...
Yeah, they wouldn't be in the position they were if they didn't.
But yeah, because obviously, like you said, we can communicate directly, but for an animal, it's eyes for how they would communicate to us, like their feelings, tails, whatever, and then vice versa. For them to know what's going on with us, they'd have to be able to pick up on those very subtle social cues.
For sure, and again, for humans, even though as verbal as we are, what that means.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That can pick a fight with somebody you don't know, right? Yeah. Now imagine a dog, again, who, only operates in that kind of mode of nonverbal. When you watch two dogs who've never met interact, it's fascinating. Mm-hmm. There is so much going on that most people don't even realize, but there is a truckload of information being exchanged that I think even the best dog experts in the world, the people who are the very best at reading dogs and understanding dog language, still have 10% of what's actually going on.
So again, mentioning kind of that decision making and then be able to read the situation, and this somewhat ties into we were talking about drones earlier and kind of the autonomous decision making on killing a target or anything like that. How often are the dogs making that decision? So again, if you guys are as a team hitting a house and like you said, there's a guy that pops up behind the couch and he goes and attacks, is it usually just bite to, take them out of the fight, or is it full on the dog makes a decision depending on the circumstances, kill or?
Well, from my, I guess, perspective or understanding, I don't believe that it's common for dogs to have the intent to necessarily dispatch or kill somebody. I could be wrong, I also think some do more than others. For some, it's more of a game. For all dogs in that position, it's not just a game. You know, there are certainly sport dogs when you look at Schutzhund or PSA or whatever that are very sporty and it's just a game and they're not serious about it. There are some dogs in those organizations who are very serious. But in the real world, when the adversary is physically capable, 4, 5, 6 times the size of the dog, not scared of the dog and intent on hurting that dog, and that dog knows that, you better have a real motherfucker on 4 legs to deal with somebody like that. And if he's not, you're going to find out immediately that dog isn't that dog and doesn't really want to hurt that person, you know? So, you know, to try to, you know, dissect whether or not the dog is actually trying to kill that person or not, I don't think in most cases that's the case. Again, I could be wrong, you know, but.
So I'm less so asking too about the dog, like making that decision itself. I'm saying is when you're doing those situations, like,
I got you.
You training the dog to be able to have that trigger if they need to?
It's both, yeah. I mean, some of it is absolutely genetic. Some of it is the conditioning through lots of repetition of the stuff we're talking about. And some of it is the dog working completely autonomous and deciding that this guy is a threat. Like, you know, the dog
needs to go.
Yeah, completely independent of the handler is saying, yeah, this dog is a threat and I'm gonna preemptively go fuck him up instead. Sometimes it's because they're told to, sometimes it's because they decide.
And so does the handler have that level of control too, of like they should be targeting too? They
have to, yeah. And in most instances, special operations wise, we'll use lasers to direct if it's from so far away that, you know, like let's say it's a squirter where going super dynamic on a target, and so you bump the dog out to a flank and you're waiting and observing the back end of the target, because that's pretty common, right? Is that a SEAL platoon runs through the door and 3 dudes or 1 dude jumps out the back window and takes off running. Now the dog is 20 yards to the side and you send him in. The dog is usually going to pick up on that. Most of the time the laser stuff is more for searching, like, hey, search this, like that door. Like if that's our entry point, right? Or like your front door, let's say we're 50 yards away and we're going to come stack on that door before we go in, but we want the dog to check if there's any explosives at the door before we go up there. Laser the dog in, hit that seam, the dog goes, searches. If there's an explosive, he indicates. If that's the case, call the dog back to you, go to a different opening, blow the structure down, whatever. But in some cases it's, hey, go, you know, we saw a guy in this tree line and we're so far away the dog didn't see him or can't smell him or whatever, and so you send the dog in to search there. But yeah.
Can the dogs, that's a really interesting point about them kind of being utilized to give a sense what's in the room. Are they able to indicate, I'm sure they can indicate if there's like active combatants in there, obviously, again, from just the smell alone. Is there any indication if they can say, you know, there's multiple? Like, are they able to communicate that, or is it more so just there is someone in there?
Yeah, I would say the only potential caveat is you may see a more intense alert if there's
a lot of
10
smells.
people down there. Yeah, just because the substance of odors is probably going to be a lot stronger, and you may see a more intense indication. But I would say, as a general rule, no, it's that there's human odor present or there isn't.
Mm-hmm. So obviously Belgian Malinois, I would say, would be the most consistent and successful breed, right? Or would you kind of? I
would say the Belgian Malinois, the Dutch Shepherd, and the German Shepherd are all consistently utilized in this application. The Malinois and the Dutch Shepherd, from my perspective, and there's other dog professionals that would argue or say that I'm an idiot for saying this, but I just respectfully disagree, is that to me it's like a chocolate lab and a yellow lab. A Dutch Shepherd and a Malinois are, in my opinion, the same thing. Genetically, I think they are from a breeding coefficient standpoint, and that the Malinois coat coloring is a recessive trait. The Dutch Shepherd or brindle dark coloring is dominant. And we know this because when you breed Malinois to Malinois, you only get Malinois. If you breed Malinois and Dutch Shepherds, you get some of each. If you breed Dutch Shepherd to Dutch Shepherd, you can get Dutch Shepherds or Malinois. So to me, recessive dominant wise, when there's that predictability within a breed, you only see that in the same breed typically. Mm-hmm. Similar with labs. yellow lab or, a light nose is recessive, black lab is dominant. And you see that same thing. You can breed 2 black labs and they can throw a yellow lab. So to me, that tells me it's the same breed and not a different breed. But to me, it's kind of semantics. The reality is any dog that passes that selection criteria is basically going to be the same dog with a different paint job. Even if you found, a Mastiff that would do it, like if he has all of the tools at that level and has all the athletic ability and whatever, then all of those dogs that can make it through that entire selection process are all going to be really similar.
So I'd imagine this will be the biggest hurdle, obviously, is probably athletic ability. I mean, some of the shit that the Malinois and Dutch Shepherds can do is fucking crazy. But moving that out of the kind of what you're looking for, if you're just looking on kind of mental ability and capabilities, do you think that there's a larger majority of breeds, or really any breed, that would be able to kind of accomplish this if they have the right makeup?
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why Malinois, Dutch Shepherds, and German Shepherds are pretty much exclusively used in police and military and protection dog work, is because percentage chance-wise, they have an overwhelmingly higher percentage chance of possessing all of those traits. It's not to say that you couldn't find a dog that's not in one of those 3 breeds or 2 breeds that possesses those. I haven't. Doesn't mean that they don't exist. I haven't come across one, whether it's Dobermans or Bouviers or giant Schnauzers or what any of the other kind of older fashioned or historical guard dog type of dogs. I've not come across any. I'm sure that there are some that exist. They're just very rare.
Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, I guess, overall capabilities, what would be the most impressive dog you've either heard of or seen or trained yourself that you can kind of point a finger to and be like, this is kind of the perfect example of what is possible with, these dogs?
Like a specific dog or a breed?
Specific dog.
Man, it's tough. I would say, when I was on the West Coast, we had a dozen dogs there that were all what I would consider world class, because they had to be, and so, there have been dogs since then here and there that are on that par or caliber, but they're a 10 out of 10 in every category, and that is rare. A lot of times if you look at those 5 categories that I mentioned, if you've got 7 out of 10 in every category, like that's a really nice dog. If you have 10 out of 10, like that's a unicorn. You just don't come across them often.
Yeah, I know John Norris, when I had him on, he was mentioning when he was on your show, he talked about, I'm blanking on the dog's name, but he was like, yeah, it had this many bites. And you were like, holy shit, like it had that many bites? He's like, yeah. But it's always just unique to be able to see. It's like their capabilities just from training alone. Like they can become, such, not lethal weapons, but just both lethal weapons and also just great assets in the field.
Absolutely. I mean, they're a force protection and force multiplier to a degree with which I think it's hard to put an X factor on for sure, because they're just so capable.
So I guess going to more like civilian life with dogs and everything. I guess the first caveat, I was talking with you offline. I was like, my dog's biggest issue is, he's a little energetic, and he gets really excited, like not leash aggression, but like leash activity. Is the idea that you can't teach an old dog new tricks?
No, just like with people, dogs are always learning. You can teach a 10-year-old dog new stuff if you want, if you put the time in. Just like with people, the more bad habits they have for longer periods of time, the more challenging it's going to be. But you can absolutely teach a dog of any age to do anything that genetically they're capable of doing. So, that's a myth for sure.
Mm-hmm. If you had to recommend like how someone should start maybe that first 6 months when they first get a dog, because that's obviously like some of the most critical time in that dog's development, how would you structure that approach?
Yeah. I actually have an online training program that I go through all of that, called Team Dog, teamdog.pet. I also have a dog tier on my Patreon page where I do a bunch of videos and answer questions and help people with problems that they run into. The way that that's set up is what I'm about to describe in kind of an abbreviated fashion, which is think of boot camp. You know, if you think about the level of training and kind of conditioning that human beings receive in a boot camp like environment is significant. You know, if you take the day you show up at boot camp to 8 to 12 weeks later, depending on what branch of service, the amount of change that takes place in that short window of time, there's a couple of very specific reasons why that's possible. And that's controlling of environment, manipulating that environment so that it's very, very consistent, regimented, predictable, and that the subject, whether it's the dog or the boot camp student, understands the expectations and that's communicated to them. Obviously, with a dog, you can't verbally communicate that, so you have to do it through your actions, which makes it even more important to be super disciplined and regimented in that first 2 to 6 month period. And then lastly, being consistent. You know, consistency is your absolute best friend when it comes to training your dog. If it's okay, it's always okay. If it's not okay, it's never okay. It doesn't matter how tired you are or what time in middle of the night it is, you've got to stay consistent. I like to use a crate in those early phases or early few months exclusively. A lot of people think that that's cruel or mean or that it's, you know, counterproductive. I respectfully disagree in that. Number one, it's a tool. You can make positive associations with that tool the same way you can anything. You can make negative associations with that tool the same way you can with any other tool, a leash, your hand, whatever. But what it provides is a neutral stimulus ground where if a dog, and one of the things you'll hear me kind of repeat often in the online training and even probably for the rest of this episode is always putting yourself in the dog's shoes, right? We look at things from the human perspective, which is you're rationalizing things, you're thinking in a language, you know, kind of like what I was talking about with the way dogs communicate. The way dogs think is also quite different than from the way we think. You know, when you are thinking about anything, what's going through your mind? A language, right? So you're verbalizing, even though it's internal, you're using a language to think your way through something. Try to imagine a world where that's not possible, where that doesn't exist, right? It's hard to even imagine what that's like. You're standing in line at Walmart and you're talking shit in your mind about the guy in front of you because he's taking so long, right? Dogs' minds work more like a calculator than they do our minds, right? So for them, it's a very simple association. It's A plus B equals C for everything. And so just understanding that is going to help you navigate your training sessions, your day-to-day life, every single interaction with your dog, understanding that he doesn't think in a language. He's also not pre-wired with any of the expectations that we have for them until we communicate them. Well, how do we communicate them? Not verbally, through our actions. So you're shaping and conditioning that dog's behavior. And the way that you do that is consistency, setting up the environment so that they're not able to make mistakes when they do their teaching moments. The only way you can really accomplish that early on is to have the dog in a crate or a very small confined space when you're not interacting with and shaping that dog's behavior. So think of it like a neutral zone. It's not positive, it's not negative, it's not learning, it's hitting the pause button. What that means is that you need to get that dog out very often, every couple hours, for anywhere from 5 minutes to the better part of an hour, depending on what you're doing with them. And what I like to do is whatever amount of food that dog is going to feed or eat, I've got that in a Tupperware or a container on top of the crate. I've got a treat pouch, I've got a clicker, and I've got a leash. Right before I come up to the dog in the crate, I put a couple handfuls of food in that pouch, put that on my belt, grab the leash, grab the clicker, open the gate, clip the leash to him, and I start shaping behavior, eye contact, sitting, downing, waiting when the door opens. All of those things that I'm going to want behaviorally. I'm going to shape that by marking it with the clicker and then feeding him. So he's not eating. You're not feeding any less amount of food throughout the day, but he's getting a small handful at a time for doing what I want without actually telling him to do it. So that's making him think. He starts to understand when I offer behavior, that's when I get fed. And then you provide patterns. He recognizes patterns. Well, it's only when I put my ass on the ground. It's only when my elbows touch the ground for downing. It's only when I look into his eyes. It's only when I wait at the door. All of the things that we want him to do, we're shaping that. Once it becomes very predictable, that's when you couple a command. And so it's really just doing that for a few months. And then you get to where less and less time in the crate, and then ultimately no time in the crate. So early on, no free meals. I saw you had a free meal sitting upstairs.
Yeah.
Because again, put yourself in the dog's shoes, right? Is that if I'm getting fed, which is one of very few primary reinforcers in the dog, a lot of things that you can reward a dog with are wants or secondary reinforcers. Food is a primary. The dog has to eat. He's not going to starve himself. If he only gets fed when he makes eye contact with you, when he doesn't respond on leash to the other dogs, even if you stand there and wait, right? So I would hit the hard reset and you use a crate if you can. In an apartment environment, it can be tough if the dog is super vocal. We can get into that. But even in the case where we're talking about the leash management stuff, is that if you're only feeding him through training, and even if you're just doing eye contact, sitting, downing, and being calm, the absence of a behavior is also a behavior. So in this case, let's say, you're standing at the window, he's on leash, you've got your food in your pouch, your clicker, you're standing there, he loses his mind. Just wait. The instant he stops, click, bam, you get food. I'm not saying anything to him, I'm not punishing him, I'm waiting for him to decide to stop. As you do this more and more, and he sees that you have the pouch and food, he's going to anticipate, oh, we're training. This is game time. I need to start offering behaviors to get fed. And he starts to do things. And that's where you can really shape tricks and parlor gigs. And
so they can process that if it's
for sure.
You give them the treat after they just did the wrong action.
Mm-hmm.
And then as soon as they stop, you treat, like they don't just.
Yeah, the key is that clicker, the marker.
And so the marker tells them it's just that instinct of
the marker is the bridge between the behavior and the reward. So that A plus B equals C scenario, when we do A plus B equals C so many times to where the presence of A equals the anticipation of C, that's when the dog is now trained. Mm-hmm. A good example of that to kind of mentally highlight that process in a formula application is grabbing the leash. I don't know if do you have a leash hanging up?
I don't. It's with him at the place.
Okay. Do you normally have it there?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's always there?
Yeah.
When you come down here and you grab the leash, does he get excited?
Yeah. I've trained him to be like, we're going, he'll come down and sit. Like he is good about that. He sits and waits for the leash. Yeah.
If you didn't do that, he would get spun up and lose his mind, right?
For like not grabbing the leash?
If you grab the leash. Like if you come down here and you grab the leash and you
he come running down. He'd be like, cool.
We've all seen the dogs that the second you grab that leash, they go ballistic.
Yeah.
Right? So this is that classic example is grabbing the leash is your A variable. Connecting it to the dog's neck is B. C or equals C, we go for a walk, right? Why does that happen? Why does the dog lose his mind? Because the presence of A grabbing the leash equals the anticipation of C going for a walk. So in his mind, grabbing the leash equals going for a walk. Because we've done that so many times, and it's only been that same formula every single time for that to make sense formula-wise in the dog's mind. Now it becomes E equals MC squared in the dog's mind. It is the formula. Mm. So how do we break that? Well, now you want to make A plus B not equal C until he stops anticipating it. So grab the leash, connect it to his neck, unclip it, hang it back up, go sit down. And now the dog's like, what the fuck just happened? Right? His mind is totally blown. Like now the earth's flat or it's round, depending on what you believe. And so think of it like their mind is kind of like a piggy bank, and there's all these coins that make that A plus B equals C formula, or positive coins in the dog's bank, or negative coins in the dog's mental piggy bank. You need to put more of the opposite coin in that dog's mental bank until he stops anticipating that. Then you can take it a step further, where the second he calms down, click, now I'm clipping it to the leash. If that makes him wind up again, I'm going to stand here and wait. The second you're calm, click, food, and now we go for a walk.
So what exactly is the clicking like instinctually doing to the dog? Is that creating that separation of like?
It's an equal sign in the dog's mind is that click equals the reward. Mm-hmm. So that the click is the reward to the dog. Like if once you condition that dog, if you just grab the clicker and click it, in his mind, the reward is part of that. It's attached to it. It's associated. It's the bridge or equal sign to that. Another good way to think of it, and I've actually seen it used in performance athletes with gymnastics and powerlifting, or Olympic weightlifting rather, not powerlifting. Very technical skill sets, is coaches using clickers when the athlete is in the exact form-wise position that they want them in, so that they can understand, I know what my body feels like in that click. Another good way to think of it is the shutter on a camera, is that you're taking a snapshot of an active behavior when it's in the exact position that you want,
process with,
and the dog understands, and so the criteria I use for sitting is the instant that the ass touches the ground. For downing, it's the instant the elbows, not when it's like that. We've all seen dogs half-ass lay down. It's bam. And that's where you're timing. You have to think of it like you're taking pictures of an action sequence, and your timing has to be exact with the clicker, not with rewarding. Yes, you want to get the reward to them quickly. Your timing has to be spot on with that clicker. And that's what bridges everything together.
So then again, so some of the bad instincts and everything, right? So mentioning having on the leash and gets excited, sees another dog, and you wait till they wrap up, click, treat. So the dog's able to essentially compartmentalize, can't even say that word, and process that, like, when I was doing this, that was bad. As soon as I chilled out, like, I got rewarded.
Yeah. In essence, yes, but I think there is an important distinction to make of not thinking of it even necessarily in bad or good. It's doing something or not doing something. Mm-hmm. It's doesn't matter what you're doing. You're not doing what I want you to do. The second you do what I want, that's when you get what you want. Where this only works is feeding through training. If the dog's getting free meals and getting satiated food-wise for no reason, i.e. a full bowl of food, and you're constantly filling it up every time it's empty, his drive to offer behavior and for that to work is diminished significantly or almost entirely, unless you have just a crazy high food drive dog that would eat a bag of dog food and kill himself from overeating, which there are some. Even then, it's still less effective. And so you'll see, even over a 2, 3, 4 day period, that if you're only feeding that way, that the dog's drive for food and knows that you have the food and knows he has to do something to get it, you'll see it just skyrocket. To me, that's where the light bulb comes on, and that's where it becomes really fun, because now you can shape whatever behavior you want, begging, rolling over, playing dead, being shy. I mean, you can teach a bunch of useless but fun parlor trick type behaviors, but that are honestly good for the dog to learn. And I encourage people to do that. Not only that, but that helps you work on your timing. It helps the dog learn the game and learn how to learn. And it's fun, but it's positive. It's a positive way that the dog learns how to behave how you want him to, without any force, without any compulsion, without any negative association. And when it comes to, positive reinforcement, it's a bit nuanced. Some people may think of it as semantics. I think it's an important distinction, is that in the 4 quadrants of operant conditioning, which is positive and negative reinforcement, positive and negative punishment, positive and negative are not good and bad. They're adding and subtracting, and that is really important to remember, because people will say, or they'll confuse positive reinforcement or most often negative reinforcement. They will say using a prong or a remote collar is negative reinforcement. It's not. It's positive punishment, because you're adding punishment. Negative reinforcement is you're removing reinforcement, so you're withholding a reward in this case. That's the technical definition of negative reinforcement is subtracting a reward. Mm-hmm. It kind of doesn't matter, but I think it's important to understand that, because when you're communicating with other people, with other owners, other trainers, it's important to understand what you're talking about, and knowing what you're talking about. But more importantly, as it relates to the practical application of the dog, is that you want to add reinforcement when it's something that you want to occur again. You want to withhold reinforcement or add punishment when it's an undesirable behavior that you want to extinguish. I always like to use positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement to shape that behavior first. An example of negative reinforcement is exactly what we talked about, is that I have the reward, you know I have the reward, you want the reward, you start losing your mind. I'm withholding that reward until you do what I want, and then I'm adding it, if that makes sense.
And then once you shape a dog to a lot of those activities, I guess, how do you stay consistent with it? Are you pulling back and kind of becoming more normalized? And like you're saying, instead of putting food on top of the crate, you may leave out the bowl at like 6 o'clock for them to eat on like a normal schedule? Or are you kind of consistently sticking with that?
No, I'd say once it's dependable and predictable in all environments, and by all environments, I mean all environments. So if you're walking on the street and another dog is dragging its owner, trying to attack your dog, and he's looking up at you, ignoring that dog entirely, your dog is trained, and or the dog's off leash, you drop the leash accidentally, and he starts chasing a squirrel. He's in full prey drive, and Wrangler's his name?
Yeah.
Wrangler here, and he fucking turns on a dime, spins back, and comes right back to you. That's cemented in there, and then you can extinguish or get rid of that. I do still recommend occasionally doing some short training sessions, maybe a couple times a month, where maybe just a handful of treats, down heel, down in motion, down stay, distraction, et cetera, to just keep them sharp, because you should, and it's good for them. But the goal is to get to where you're living a normal life with a dog. It hinges on being really, really dedicated and consistent and disciplined in that training phase portion, which is anywhere from 2 to 6 months.
And how would you go about, is that all kind of like the same catalyst of training off leash? Like, obviously, I imagine you don't want to just go to a park and let the dog off leash and say, go for it. Like, how would you kind of start using that into?
So I like to use a classroom. I'll set up a classroom, with your living environment. Unfortunately, this is what I would use as my classroom. I would remove everything out of here. I like to start with an elevated dog bed, like a Caranda aluminum frame. It's about 6 inches off the ground, Morin vinyl. And so like I would remove everything out of this room, and we only come down here to train. And so every time I get him out of the crate, we come down the stairs, and within 3-4 sessions, he's going to know we're coming here, we're going to train him and offer behavior, and that's how you can shape, and he learns how to learn. But that dog bed is in the middle of the room. I'm standing in the corner, completely frozen, just standing there waiting. If he looks at the bed, mark, reward. Takes a step towards it, mark and reward. Takes a step on it, mark, maybe flood 3 or 4 rewards. I want to teach him to go away from, and that's the first thing I'll typically do, that and just eye contact in the first interactions with the dog, is when there's an elevated dog bed and it's away from what he wants, i.e. me with the food. When that dog's light bulb turns on and he understands, to get what I want, I actually have to go further away from what I want to get it. Dude, the sky's the limit. That's when they understand the game and they understand what you're trying to accomplish. But he's doing that on his own. I'm not telling him, I'm not luring him, I'm not baiting him. I'm waiting for him to do it, and I'm shaping him. And within 2 or 3 sessions, you can get a dog that as soon as he sees that bed, if you've got, a big backyard that's a half acre, and you're standing anywhere, that dog sees the dog bed and he's at full tilt, running full speed, launches himself on top of that, and then looks at you like, all right, where is it? Like, very quickly, without saying a word to the dog, you can shape and teach them to go get on a dog bed on their own very quickly. And then from there, increased duration criteria, et cetera. And I walk through all that stuff much further in depth in the online training and Patreon stuff. But that's kind of the general gist.
I guess circling to that too, I mean, like I kicked off with the podcast, been a huge fan of your shows for years. What kind of drove you to really want to start the podcast?
So it was a combination of being asked, it was kind of like what we talked about with politics, is that, when my first book came out and then subsequent books, I did book tours and speaking engagements and was on, it was being interviewed on shows or podcasts. And after a few years of just getting a lot of messages of people saying, hey, I saw you on such and such show or whatever. Have you ever thought about starting your own? I think you'd be a great podcast host. And so that was half of it. The other half was when I saw Trump's first election, the way that he navigated kind of the back and forth with interviews and debates and press conferences and things like that, and seeing kind of how raw he was and how blunt and just said what was on his mind. And I could see the wheels turning of the American public in his traction and popularity. And obviously that's something that our society was starved of, was people who actually said what they thought with no fucking thought of what the consequences were. That made me realize, one, that's more my personality. Two, there are almost no outlets that actually provide a platform to have that raw, unfiltered, politically incorrect, no bullshit type of conversation. So those two things combined, I was like, I'm going to give it a shot and see how it goes. And it immediately, from my perspective, warranted continuing to do it. And then as it grew and got sponsors and, media deals and all that, it's just kind of continued. And now it's turned into, one of the bigger things that I do. So, and I've been, very grateful for the opportunity to even be able to do it. And I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, like I said, man, the show is kick ass. And, even to add into, I mean, guys like me or Julian or stuff that started up over the past couple of years, like you've been a huge inspiration for us, like wanting to do this too. And
I appreciate
really paved the way on that too. So
that's very, very kind and humbling. I appreciate it.
If you want to let people know where to find you both, for, any interest in maybe getting involved, with dogs, whether it's, going to the Patreon page or anything like that for some handling or.
Yeah. So, YouTube is Mike Drop. Honestly, if you just Google my name, MikeRitland.com or teamdog.pet will come up, and all of the links to Patreon, to Warrior Dog Foundation, to the dog food, to the podcast, books. Pretty much everything I have going on is in that hub of MikeRitland.com or teamdog.pet. So all the Instagram links and all that stuff are all on there.
Perfect. Well, brother, thank you so much for coming on, and I'll have you meet Wrangler.
Yeah, I appreciate it, man. Thank you much. Thanks for having me.